Let's take a deep breath, relax, and slowly explore the story of glass. Long before any human hand learned to shape it, the Earth was already making glass on its own. In the volcanic highlands of what is now eastern Turkey, roughly 10,000 years ago, a hunter knelt beside a dark, gleaming outcrop and chipped away at a stone unlike any other. It fractured with an almost surgical precision, leaving edges so sharp they could slice skin at a touch. That stone was obsidian, a natural glass born from the cooling of molten lava, and it was about to become one of the most coveted materials in the prehistoric world. Obsidian forms when lava erupts from a volcano and cools so rapidly that its tiny building blocks have no time to arrange themselves into neat, orderly patterns. Instead, they freeze in a jumbled, disordered state, creating a material that is extraordinarily hard and sharp. Modern surgeons have actually experimented with obsidian blades and found that they can produce cleaner cuts than the finest steel scalpels. The ancient toolmakers who first chipped obsidian into arrowheads and scrapers did not know any of this, of course, but they recognized immediately that this dark, glassy stone was better than anything else they had. For the peoples of the ancient Near East, obsidian was transformative. Scientists have traced individual pieces of obsidian back to the specific volcanoes where they were born, and what those traces reveal is a web of trade routes stretching across hundreds of miles. Obsidian from the peaks of central Turkey crossed mountain ranges to reach settlements in what is now Iraq, Syria, and the islands of the Mediterranean. This was no simple affair of one village trading with the next. These were organized networks of exchange requiring knowledge of geography, navigation, and the social relationships to sustain trade over generations. In a very real sense, obsidian, this natural glass, helped build some of the earliest trade systems in human history. At a place called Cathedrals in Turkey, one of the oldest known towns in the world, obsidian tools and mirrors were found in abundance. Can you picture that for a moment? Polished obsidian mirrors dating to roughly 6,000 years before the Common Era, among the earliest mirrors ever found. Objects in which a person could, for the very first time, see their own face reflected with reasonable clarity. These mirrors were likely not idle vanities, but held deep ritual significance, perhaps connected to beliefs about the soul, the afterlife, or the power of sight itself. But obsidian was not the only natural glass that ancient peoples encountered. Scattered across deserts and beaches lay another kind of glass. One created not by volcanic fire, but by lightning. When a bolt of lightning strikes sand, the temperature at the point of impact can exceed 30,000 degrees, more than 5 times the temperature of the surface of the sun. In that fraction of a second, the sand grains fuse into hollow tubes of glass called fulgurites. These delicate, branching structures trace the path of the electrical discharge through the ground, creating fragile glass formations that can extend a meter or more beneath the surface. Nature, it turns out, has been making glass every time a thunderstorm crosses a sandy landscape. Perhaps the most mysterious of all natural glasses lies scattered across a remote corner of the Sahara Desert. In a vast stretch of sand straddling the border between Egypt and Libya, chunks of pale yellow-green glass lie half-buried in the dunes, some as large as a human fist. This is Libyan desert glass, and its origin has puzzled scientists for nearly a century. The glass was formed roughly 28 million years ago, most likely when an asteroid or comet fragment exploded in the atmosphere above the desert, generating temperatures fierce enough to fuse the sand into glass without leaving a visible crater. The ancient Egyptians knew about this glass. The most famous piece sits at the center of a magnificent breastplate found in the tomb of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun. A carved scarab beetle, long thought to be made from a common mineral, was identified in 1998 as Libyan desert glass. Someone had ventured hundreds of miles into one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth, far from the Nile Valley, to find and retrieve this strange pale glass from the deep desert. The effort suggests that the material held extraordinary value, perhaps connected to the sun god, whose blazing chariot was thought to cross the sky each day. And the glass in that scarab had already been lying in the desert for roughly 28 million years before Egyptian craftsmen shaped it into something beautiful. There are other natural glasses scattered across the planet. Small glassy objects called tektites formed when rocks are ejected by meteorite impacts, melted in the atmosphere, and fall back to Earth as cooled glass droplets. Olive green tektites found in the Czech Republic were created by an impact in southern Germany roughly 15 million years ago and have been collected by humans since at least the Stone Age. One was found among the tools at the same site that yielded the famous Venus of Willendorf figurine, suggesting that this natural glass attracted human attention more than 25,000 years ago. Natural glasses were our first encounter with transparency, with the quiet idea that solid matter could be seen through, that light could pass through stone. Obsidian taught early toolmakers about the strange and useful ways that glassy materials break. Fulgurites showed that sand could be transformed by heat into something entirely new. And Libyan desert glass, carried across the Sahara to adorn a pharaoh's chest, hinted at the cosmic forces that could create such a material. All of these natural glasses were products of extreme heat, whether volcanic, electrical, or from the stars, and they planted a seed in the human imagination. If nature could make glass, could humans learn to do the same? The answer, when it came, would emerge not from any deliberate attempt to copy these natural wonders, but from the accidental observations of potters and metalworkers in ancient Mesopotamia. People who noticed something strange happening in their kilns, something smooth and colorful that glowed when held up to the light. Sometime around 3,500 years before the Common Era, in the flat, river-laced lands between the Tigris and the Euphrates, a potter or metalworker pulled a small glowing object from a kiln and held it up to the light. It was not clay, and it was not metal. It was something new. Something that caught the firelight and reflected it in ways that no natural stone could match. It was glass, and though this first artisan could not have known it, the substance cooling in their hand would eventually reshape civilization itself. The earliest deliberately made glass objects that archaeologists have found date to roughly that same period, and they are modest in the extreme. Small beads and decorative inlays, many no larger than a fingernail. They were opaque, often colored in shades of blue and green, and they were made not as glass for its own sake, but as a byproduct of other crafts. Scholars believe that the first glass was likely an accidental discovery, emerging from the same kilns and furnaces used for making a pre-glass material. A mixture of crushed quartz, lime, and a salty substance that, when fired, produced a bright glassy surface on ceramic objects. The Egyptians had a word for this material that meant dazzling or gleaming, and it is easy to see why. When the right combination of sand and alkali and heat came together in a kiln, the result was not just a glaze clinging to clay, but a separate, distinct material, a new substance entirely. A lump of glass found at Eridu, one of the oldest cities in Mesopotamia and revered in Sumerian mythology as the first city ever built, is among the very earliest known. This small, unassuming piece of material, recovered from a site that the Sumerians believed was the dwelling place of a god, reminds us that glassmaking emerged in a world already rich with mythology, ritual, and complex social organization. Now, there is a famous story about the origin of glass that has captivated imaginations for 2,000 years. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder told of Phoenician sailors who landed on a beach and, lacking proper cooking stones, propped their pot on blocks of a mineral salt they were carrying as cargo. When the fire heated the salt and the sand beneath it, streams of a transparent liquid substance flowed forth, and glass was born. The story is charming, but almost certainly a myth. A simple campfire on a beach would not generate temperatures high enough to fuse sand into glass. And glass was known for thousands of years before the Phoenicians rose to prominence. Yet the tale has endured because it captures something true about glass, the element of surprise, the accidental quality of its discovery, the sense that this material emerged from the convergence of common ingredients, sand and fire and salt, in an uncommon way. What Pliny's myth does capture, rather beautifully, is the essential recipe for glass. You need sand, which provides the main ingredient. You need something to lower the temperature at which sand melts, a substance like soda ash or plant ash. And you need something to keep the finished glass from dissolving in water, usually lime. Without that temperature-lowering ingredient, sand must be heated to roughly 1700 degrees, far beyond the reach of ancient kilns. With it, the melting point drops to around 1000 degrees, well within the range of Bronze Age furnace technology. This basic recipe, sand plus a flux plus a stabilizer, has remained the foundation of glassmaking for more than 5,000 years. The most extraordinary surviving documents of ancient glassmaking are a series of clay tablets found in the library of an Assyrian king who ruled in the 7th century before the Common Era. These tablets, catalogued by their ancient scribes under the title The Doors of the Kiln, contain detailed recipes for making colored glass, including instructions for constructing a special kiln and for using specific proportions of ingredients to achieve a range of colors. The recipes describe how to make glass that imitates precious stones, particularly lapis lazuli, a deep blue gemstone that was imported at great expense from the mountains of what is now Afghanistan. And here is a lovely detail. The tablets instruct the glassmaker to recite particular prayers during the firing process and to conduct the work on auspicious days chosen by divination. Glass production for the Assyrians was as much a ritual act as a technological one. What makes these tablets even more worth pausing on is their deliberate obscurity. The glassmakers appear to have encoded their instructions so that only fellow members of their guild could decipher them. Glass was a state-controlled material, valuable enough to be listed alongside precious metals and gemstones in royal inventories, and its recipes were guarded with the same jealous secrecy. This pattern, the guarding of glass secrets, would repeat itself across thousands of years, from Mesopotamia to Venice to the corporate laboratories of our own time. By the middle of the 2nd millennium before the Common Era, glassworkers had learned to make small hollow vessels by building up layers of hot glass around a core of clay and dung. These little bottles, often decorated with zigzag patterns of contrasting colors, were among the most prized luxury goods of the ancient Near East. They were expensive, affordable only to the wealthy and the powerful. Glass ingots have even been found in a famous shipwreck off the coast of Turkey, a merchant vessel that sank around 1300 years before the Common Era, carrying copper, tin, ebony, and glass. The glass was shaped into flat discs, colored deep cobalt blue, not finished products, but raw material intended for workshops elsewhere. By the late Bronze Age, glass was being traded across international networks, a commodity as valuable as any other precious substance. And so, glass took its place in the ancient world as a material of value and desire. It was not yet transparent, not yet cheap, not yet the everyday substance that fills our windows and screens. It was rare, beautiful, and mysterious. The transformation into something common would take another 3,000 years, and the first steps in that direction were already underway in the workshops of a pharaoh's capital. In the year 1892, the British archaeologist Flinders Petrie was excavating at a place called Tel El Amarna, the short-lived capital of the pharaoh Akhenaten, when he stumbled upon something unexpected. Amid the ruins of what he described as amulet factories, he found the remains of the world's earliest excavated glassmaking workshop. Scattered across the floors were fragments of colored glass, remains of small furnace vessels, and the debris of a sophisticated manufacturing operation that had been producing glass objects more than 3,000 years earlier. The story of glass in ancient Egypt is, above all, a story of color. Where Mesopotamian glass had been limited in its range, Egyptian glassmakers achieved a palette that astonished the ancient world. Their deep cobalt blue, produced by adding a mineral found in the Egyptian desert, was so vivid and so prized that it served as a stand-in for lapis lazuli, that impossibly expensive blue stone that had to be imported from the mountains of what is now Afghanistan. They also produced turquoise glass using copper, red glass through carefully controlled heating, and yellow using lead compounds. Each color required specific metallic additions at precise moments, and the evidence suggests that individual workshops often specialized in a single color, focusing all their expertise on perfecting one particular hue. The first evidence of glass production in Egypt, as opposed to simply importing finished glass from elsewhere, dates to the reign of Thutmose III, the great warrior pharaoh who ruled in the 15th century before the Common Era. Thutmose was the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, a military genius who expanded the empire to its greatest extent through 17 campaigns across the lands to the east. Among the treasures he brought back from his conquests were glass vessels and, perhaps more importantly, glassmakers themselves. It is quite possible that skilled glassworkers were brought to Egypt as prisoners of war or recruited as specialists, a practice well documented in Egyptian records for other crafts. But the Egyptians did not merely copy what others had done. They adapted and improved foreign techniques, developing their own distinctive styles and methods. Experimental reconstructions at Tel El Amarna have shown that Egyptian glassmakers could produce glass from raw materials in a single operation, using local sand and plant ash. This overturned the long-held assumption that Egypt simply imported raw glass and reworked it. The Egyptians were masters of the full production chain from raw sand to finished masterpiece. And there is evidence of a truly large-scale glass production facility at a site in the eastern Nile Delta, one that may have been the largest in the ancient world. The glass objects found in Egyptian tombs reveal extraordinary skill and a deep connection between glass and the afterlife. In the tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922, glass objects abound. Polychrome glass headrests, glass inlays set into furniture and jewelry, and glass vessels of quiet beauty accompanied the young pharaoh into eternity. The glass from his tomb spans the full color range of Egyptian glassmaking, showing that by roughly 1330 before the Common Era, these craftsmen had achieved a level of mastery that would not be equaled for centuries. Glass in ancient Egypt was not just decorative, it carried deep symbolic meaning. The Egyptian word for glass was related to the word for pouring, connecting the material to the act of ritual offering. Blue glass in particular was associated with the sky and with the life-giving waters of the Nile. The Egyptians saw in glass a substance that bridged the natural and the supernatural, that could capture the colors of precious stones while being shaped into forms impossible in nature. A glass fish pendant could hold perfumed oil. A glass amulet could protect its wearer in the afterlife. A glass vessel could contain the cosmetics that maintained the ritual purity of a priest. The reach of Egyptian glass extended far beyond the Nile Valley. Scientists have analyzed tiny glass beads found at Bronze Age sites across the Mediterranean and discovered that many carry chemical signatures matching Egyptian workshops. And here is something quietly remarkable. Glass beads of Egyptian origin have been found as far away as Scandinavia, carried along trade networks spanning thousands of miles. A study confirmed that glass beads found in Bronze Age Danish graves, dating to roughly 1400 years before the Common Era, matched the composition of Egyptian glass. These tiny objects had traveled from the banks of the Nile to the shores of the Baltic Sea more than 3,000 years ago. The workshops at Tel El Amarna operated during the reign of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who attempted to remake Egyptian religion by worshipping a single god, the sun disk. His spirit of experimentation extended to the arts, and the glass production at his capital reflects the same bold innovation that characterized his reign. The workshops produced glass in colors and forms that had not been seen before, pushing the boundaries of what was technically possible. But like Akhenaten's religious revolution, the golden age of Egyptian glass would not last. The period that followed saw a gradual decline in the quality and quantity of production, mirroring the broader political instability of the late New Kingdom. And when the great Bronze Age civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed in the upheavals of the 12th century before the Common Era, the art of glassmaking nearly vanished entirely. The furnaces went cold, the knowledge of color recipes was lost, and the workshops that had produced some of the most beautiful objects in the ancient world fell silent. The revival, when it came, would arrive not from Egypt but from the great seafaring traders of the Phoenician coast, who would eventually unlock the single most important innovation in the entire history of glass. Around 1200 years before the Common Era, the interconnected world of the late Bronze Age came crashing down. One by one, the great civilizations that had sustained centuries of trade and cultural exchange collapsed or dramatically shrank. The powerful empire in what is now Turkey disintegrated. The palace civilizations of Greece were destroyed and abandoned. Egypt entered a long period of decline. The prosperous trading cities along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean were sacked or deserted. In the space of just a few decades, the networks that had linked these civilizations for centuries were severed, and with them went the infrastructure that had supported some of the ancient world's most sophisticated crafts. Glassmaking was among the casualties. The art required specialized knowledge, expensive raw materials, sustained high temperatures, and a network of trade that provided both the necessary ingredients and the wealthy customers who could afford the finished products. When those trade networks collapsed and the palace economies that had supported glass workshops dissolved, the furnaces went cold. For roughly 2 centuries, the skills accumulated over 1,000 years were largely lost. This vulnerability was rooted in the very nature of the craft. Unlike pottery, which could be practiced at a basic level by almost anyone with access to clay and fire, glass production demanded temperatures that only specialized furnaces could achieve. It demanded chemical knowledge encoded in recipes rather than intuition, and a level of manual skill that took years to develop. This knowledge was passed from master to apprentice rather than written down, making it especially fragile. When the master glassmakers of the Bronze Age died or scattered, their knowledge went with them. The causes of the Bronze Age collapse remain debated among historians. Changes in climate, drought, famine, invasion by mysterious groups from across the sea, internal rebellion, and the cascading failure of interdependent trade systems have all been proposed. What seems clear is that no single cause was responsible. A convergence of crises overwhelmed the ability of complex, interconnected societies to adapt. For glass, the lesson is a stark one. A craft that depends on trade, specialization, and powerful patrons is vulnerable to precisely the kind of systemic disruption that the Bronze Age collapse represented. This pattern of vulnerability would recur throughout the history of glass, most dramatically with the fall of the Roman Empire and again with the great wars of the 20th century. It was not until the 9th century before the Common Era that glass production began to revive, and the revival came from an unlikely source. The Phoenicians, those master traders and sailors whose city-states lined the coast of modern-day Lebanon, took up the art of glass and made it their own. From their principal cities, they had already established themselves as the dominant commercial power of the Mediterranean, trading in everything from the famous purple dye that gave them their Greek name to cedar timber, metalwork, and textiles. Glass became another of their traded goods, and Phoenician workshops developed new techniques that would carry the craft forward. Among the most significant of these developments was the ability to produce colorless glass. Before the Phoenician revival, virtually all glass had been opaque or cloudy, colored with metallic additions to imitate precious stones. The ability to produce clear, colorless glass was a genuine breakthrough. It opened new possibilities for the material, allowing it to be appreciated for its own qualities of transparency and brilliance, rather than merely as a substitute for gemstones. The Phoenicians achieved this by adding a substance that neutralized the green tint caused by iron naturally present in sand. This seemingly simple innovation, the removal of color from glass, would prove to be one of the most important steps on the long path toward the transparent material we know today. The Phoenicians also refined the art of making small, beautifully decorated vessels, wrapping trails of hot glass around a clay core, and then scraping out the core once the glass had cooled. These little bottles, typically used to hold perfumed oils and cosmetics, were traded across the Mediterranean from the shores of North Africa to the islands of the Aegean. Decorated with combed patterns of white, yellow, and turquoise threads against a dark blue or amber background, they are among the most recognizable artifacts of the ancient Mediterranean world. But the Phoenicians' most enduring contribution was not any particular product. It was their role as connectors, as the people who spread glass technology and glass objects throughout the Mediterranean world. Their colonies and trading posts, planted from Spain to North Africa, created a network through which glassmaking knowledge could flow to new regions and new peoples. When Rome emerged as the great power of the Mediterranean, it inherited a world that the Phoenicians had already furnished with the basic skills and trade routes of glass production. And the most important innovation in the history of glass was about to emerge from this very Phoenician world. Sometime around 50 years before the Common Era, in a workshop on the coast where glass had been made for nearly 1,000 years, a glassworker picked up a hollow tube, gathered a blob of molten glass on one end, and gently blew. In the old city of Jerusalem, archaeologists excavating an ancient ritual bath dating to the 1st century before the Common Era found something that would rewrite the history of technology. Among the debris were fragments of glass tubes, glass rods, and tiny blown bottles, the waste products of a nearby glass workshop. Some of the tubes had been sealed at one end and partially inflated by blowing through the other, while still hot, forming small, crude bottles. These fragments represent the earliest known evidence of glass blowing, and simple as they may seem, they record the beginning of one of the most transformative inventions in the 5,000-year history of glass. Before glass blowing, every glass vessel had to be formed by a slow, laborious method. A craftsman might shape hot glass around a clay core, or cast it in a mold, or grind it from a solid block. Each technique required extensive labor and produced only small quantities of relatively thick, heavy vessels. A skilled worker using the core method might produce a handful of small perfume bottles in a day, and each one would be expensive enough to be considered a luxury. Glass blowing changed all of that. By gathering a blob of molten glass on the end of a hollow iron tube and blowing gently, a glassworker could produce a thin-walled vessel in minutes rather than hours. The technique was faster. It used less glass, and it could produce containers in an almost unlimited variety of shapes and sizes. A bottle, a bowl, a flask, a jug, a cup, all could be fashioned from the same basic process of gathering, blowing, and shaping. The tube itself was a simple instrument, but in the hands of a skilled glassblower, it became an extension of the lungs and the imagination, capable of producing forms of quiet beauty and surprising complexity. The effect on the economics of glass was immediate and dramatic. What had been a luxury material restricted to the courts of kings and the tables of the wealthy could now be produced cheaply enough to be within reach of ordinary people. In the space of a few generations, glass went from being as precious as silver to being as common as pottery. This was not a gradual evolution, but a revolution, as sudden and transformative in its way as the invention of the printing press would be 1,500 years later. Within a few decades, glass blowing had spread across the Eastern Mediterranean, and a new generation of glassworkers was pushing the technique to remarkable levels of skill. The greatest of these early masters was a man named Ennion, who worked somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean around the 1st century of the Common Era. Ennion was the first known maker of decorated mold-blown glass, a refinement in which the blown glass was inflated into a mold to produce vessels of consistent shape and decoration. Around 26 examples of his work survive, and each one carries a proud inscription in Greek letters that translates simply as "Ennion made it." Can you picture that for a moment? In an era when most craftsmen were anonymous, this man signed his work. He was creating what may have been the first brand name in the history of goods made for sale. His drinking cups and bowls were traded throughout the Mediterranean and were in great demand among wealthy Romans. Ennion was not just a craftsman, but a designer, someone who understood that the beauty of a vessel mattered as much as its function. The development of mold blowing, where glass was inflated into reusable molds, represented yet another leap forward. A single mold could produce hundreds or even thousands of identical vessels, a form of mass production the ancient world had never seen applied to glass. The combination of free blowing for custom work and mold blowing for production wares created an industry that was ready to serve the demands of the largest and most consumer-oriented empire the world had yet seen. That empire was Rome, and the Romans would take the invention of glass blowing and do what Romans did best. They would industrialize it, standardize it, and spread it across 3 continents. Glass workshops soon appeared in Italy, in what is now France, along the Rhine, and even in distant Britain, following the legions and the trade routes that connected every corner of the empire. The inventor of glassblowing is unknown and will likely remain so forever. Unlike the telescope or the printing press, this world-changing innovation cannot be attributed to any single person. It emerged from the collective experience of generations of glassworkers who had spent centuries handling molten glass, who understood its properties at an intuitive level, and who were constantly experimenting with new ways to shape it. The leap from dipping a rod into molten glass to blowing through a hollow tube seems, looking back, almost obvious, but it took thousands of years for someone to make it. What we can say is that this anonymous invention, born in a small workshop along the eastern Mediterranean coast, proved to be one of the most consequential in human history. It made glass cheap, it made glass common, and it set the stage for a transformation that would turn glass from a luxury curiosity into the transparent fabric of modern civilization. In the ruins of Pompeii, buried beneath the ash of Vesuvius since that terrible August day in the year 79, archaeologists have found something that speaks volumes about how Romans lived. They found window panes. Not all Roman windows had glass. Most homes used wooden shutters or oiled cloth, but the wealthier residents of Pompeii installed flat sheets of cast glass in their windows, particularly in bathhouses, where warmth needed to be kept in while light was let through. These panes were thick and slightly cloudy rather than perfectly clear, but they represent the earliest widespread use of glass in architecture. The Romans had begun to see glass not just as a material for cups and jewelry, but as something that could reshape the very experience of being inside a building. The Roman Empire transformed glass from a craft into an industry. The scale was unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Massive factories operated in Alexandria along the coasts of what are now Israel and Lebanon, in the German Rhineland, and in other cities across the empire. The glassmakers of Alexandria were especially renowned, producing everything from simple household cups to extraordinary works of art. They benefited from their closeness to deposits of a mineral salt essential to glassmaking and from the deep pool of skilled workers in what was the cultural and commercial capital of the Eastern Mediterranean. Among the supreme achievements of Roman glassmaking is an object now in the British Museum in London called the Portland vase. Created sometime in the early 1st century of the Common Era, it is a deep cobalt blue vase overlaid with a layer of white glass, which was then carefully carved away in a technique borrowed from gem cutters. The scene that emerges shows mythological figures set against the deep blue background, and the precision of the carving represents skills developed to the highest level. But even the Portland vase pales in comparison to the most scientifically extraordinary piece of Roman glass ever found. A cup that appears jade green when viewed in reflected light, but transforms to a deep ruby red when light passes through it from behind. This remarkable color-changing effect baffled scientists for decades until analysis revealed the secret. The glass contains particles of gold and silver so tiny that each one is less than 1,000th the size of a grain of table salt. These almost impossibly small particles alter the way light behaves as it passes through the glass, creating what modern scientists recognize as an early example of what we would now call nanotechnology. The cage cups represent perhaps the ultimate achievement of Roman glass skill. Each one began as a single thick block of glass, which was then painstakingly carved and undercut to create an outer cage of decoration connected to the inner vessel only by thin bridges. The slightest mistake could shatter the entire piece. Fewer than 50 fragments of cage cups survive from the ancient world, making them among the rarest objects to have come down to us from Roman civilization. Roman glass production was organized on what we would recognize as an industrial scale. At a site near the coast of what is now Israel, archaeologists uncovered a factory with 17 furnaces, each capable of producing several tons of raw glass in a single firing. The raw glass was then broken into chunks and shipped to workshops throughout the empire, where it was remelted and shaped into finished products. This two-stage system separating raw material production from final manufacturing is strikingly similar to modern industrial organization. The range of Roman glass products was enormous. Archaeological sites across the empire yield drinking cups, plates, bowls, perfume bottles, storage jars, gaming pieces, beads, and window panes. Glass tableware appeared at every level of society, from the cheap cups used in taverns to the elaborate engraved vessels on aristocratic dining tables. A Roman writer of the 1st century remarked, with what sounds like mild astonishment, that a glass cup had become cheaper than a haircut. The geographic reach of Roman glass was equally impressive. Roman glass has been found in archaeological sites as far east as China and as far north as Scandinavia, carried along trade routes that connected the empire to distant civilizations. These tiny objects, traveling thousands of miles from the furnaces where they were made, map the contours of ancient commerce with quiet precision. The Romans were also, rather remarkably, among the first people to recycle glass on a significant scale. Broken glass called cullet was systematically collected and remelted, both because it was cheaper to process than raw materials and because it lowered the temperature needed to make new glass. This practice, born of economic common sense in the workshops of the ancient world, anticipated by 2,000 years the glass recycling programs of our own era. When the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, the glass industry in Europe contracted dramatically, but did not entirely disappear. In the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly in the lands of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world, the traditions of Roman glass continued to evolve and flourish. But in Western Europe, the loss of Roman organization meant that large-scale production gave way to smaller, more local workshops, and the extraordinary technical achievements of the Roman masters would not be equaled for more than 1,000 years. In the great mosques of medieval Cairo, Damascus, and Jerusalem, hundreds of glass lamps hung from chains, their decorated surfaces catching the light of oil flames and casting it across the vast prayer halls in patterns of color and shadow. These mosque lamps, produced in extraordinary numbers between the 13th and 15th centuries, represent one of the highest achievements in the entire history of glass decoration. Each lamp was hand-blown, then carefully painted with colored glass pastes mixed with metallic compounds, and fired again to fuse the decoration permanently to the surface. The inscriptions on these lamps, typically verses from the Quran, including the famous words that God is the light of the heavens and the earth, transformed everyday objects into sacred texts made visible, hanging words of God rendered in glass and firelight. While European glassmaking struggled in the centuries after the fall of Rome, the Islamic world not only preserved Roman glass traditions but elevated them to entirely new levels of beauty. The Islamic glass industry benefited from the continuity of city life and trade in the Eastern Mediterranean, from the support of wealthy rulers, and from a scientific culture that valued the careful investigation of how the natural world works, including the behavior of light and matter. The workshops of Fatimid Cairo, which flourished from the 10th to the 12th century, were especially renowned for their production of cut glass. In this technique, thick glass was carved and polished using the same methods employed by cutters of rock crystal, a natural mineral many times more valuable. The glassworkers of Cairo produced vessels of such clarity and precision that they were sometimes mistaken for genuine crystal. The treasury of one of the Fatimid rulers reportedly included thousands of pieces of crystal and cut glass, a hint of the enormous scale of production and collecting in this wealthy court. The painted and gilded decoration that reached its peak under the Mamluk rulers built on centuries of technical experimentation. Glassworkers had been applying metallic finishes and colored enamels to glass since at least the 8th century, but it was in the 13th and 14th centuries that the technique achieved its fullest expression. The mosque lamps were commissioned by sultans, military commanders, and wealthy merchants for the mosques and schools they endowed, and they were produced in workshops in Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo. Each lamp bore the emblem of its patron, a symbol indicating rank and office within the military hierarchy, turning these vessels into religious, artistic, and political statements all at once. But the contribution of the Islamic world to the history of glass extends far beyond decorative objects. It was a scientist of the Islamic world who laid the foundations for the modern understanding of how light works, the very science that makes glass useful. A scholar born in the city of Basra around 965 of the Common Era, known in the West as Alhazen, spent much of his working life in Cairo. His great work, the Book of Optics, written in the early 11th century, systematically investigated the nature of vision, light, and color through careful experiments and mathematical reasoning. His work was truly groundbreaking. He overturned the ancient Greek idea that vision worked by rays shooting out from the eyes, demonstrating instead that light enters the eye from outside sources. He conducted detailed experiments with light passing through glass and water, studying the way it bends and reflects with a rigor that anticipated modern scientific methods. He used a dark room with a small opening to project images and demonstrate his theories, an early version of the camera. His investigation of lenses and curved mirrors laid the groundwork that would, centuries later, contribute to the invention of spectacles, telescopes, and microscopes. When his Book of Optics was translated into Latin in the 12th century, it profoundly influenced European thinkers for generations. Without this foundational work, the optical revolution that glass would later enable might have been delayed by centuries. Islamic glass was also widely traded. From the markets of Baghdad and Cairo, glass objects traveled along trade routes connecting the Islamic world to China, India, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. A traveler visiting Cairo in the 1040s described the extraordinary transparency and quality of Egyptian glass vessels, and the markets of the city were famous for their glass shops. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century and the conquest of Damascus by a Central Asian conqueror in 1400 devastated the glass workshops of the Eastern Islamic world. When Damascus was sacked, its glassmakers and other craftsmen were reportedly carried away to the conqueror's distant capital, effectively ending the city as a center of glass production. But the skills and traditions of Islamic glassmaking had already been transmitted to other parts of the world, including the Venetian workshops that would come to dominate European glass for the next several centuries. Venice's close trading relationship with Egypt and Syria ensured that Islamic techniques, including enameling and gilding, were absorbed into the Venetian tradition, where they would be transformed into something new. In a climate-controlled gallery of a treasury in the ancient Japanese city of Nara, a building that has preserved its treasures for nearly 1300 years, there sits a white glass bowl with circular facets cut into its surface. The bowl was not made in Japan. It was not made anywhere in East Asia. It traveled the entire length of the Silk Road from a workshop in Persia, crossing deserts, mountains, and vast grasslands to reach the eastern end of the ancient trade network. Beside it rests a pear-shaped glass vessel with a delicate handle, also Persian, also carried thousands of miles to this wooden storehouse. These objects, preserved alongside roughly 9,000 other artifacts from across the ancient world, represent one of the most vivid material records of Silk Road trade in existence. And they tell us something essential about glass in East Asia. For most of its history, glass was something that came from somewhere else. China had glass from at least the 11th century before the Common Era, when early production of glassy materials appeared at several archaeological sites. But the relationship between Chinese civilization and glass was fundamentally different from its relationship in the West. While Western cultures increasingly valued glass for its transparency, its ability to hold liquids, and its versatility, China already possessed materials that served these functions beautifully. Jade, the supreme material of Chinese culture, carried associations with virtue, immortality, and cosmic power that glass could never match. Porcelain, which Chinese potters developed to extraordinary levels of refinement, was harder, more durable, and more beautiful than any glass the ancient Chinese produced. Lacquerware was waterproof and elegant. In a civilization that had already perfected these materials, glass was neither necessary nor particularly valued. This does not mean that Chinese glassmakers were unskilled. By the 5th century before the Common Era, imported glass objects from the West were reaching China in the form of colorful beads, and these imports inspired the production of Chinese versions. Chinese glassmakers developed their own distinctive recipes using different metallic compounds, creating materials with different properties and appearances than Western glass. Some of the most striking Chinese glass objects are those that deliberately imitate jade, reflecting the cultural priority placed on that material. Glass was valued in China, not for being glass, but for being a convincing substitute for something more prestigious. One of the most characteristic Chinese glass objects is a type of bead decorated with concentric circles of colored glass that resemble the compound eyes of an insect. These beads, originally produced in the Eastern Mediterranean, reached China through Central Asian trade networks. Chinese workshops began making their own versions, and the beads became popular ornaments and grave goods throughout several centuries of Chinese history. Korea's glass story, while less well documented, reveals equally interesting connections to the wider world. Glass beads from the period roughly spanning the 1st through 7th centuries of the Common Era have been found to contain chemical signatures linking them to workshops in the Roman and Persian worlds. The Korean peninsula, it turns out, was connected to trade networks that brought goods from the Mediterranean all the way to the shores of East Asia. The kingdoms of this era all used glass beads as markers of status, and the presence of Western glass in Korean royal tombs speaks to the prestige that exotic materials from distant lands carried. In Japan, glass beads appear in archaeological sites dating back roughly 2,000 years, arriving as imports from the Asian mainland. But glass never developed into a major Japanese craft tradition during the medieval period, overshadowed by the extraordinary achievements of Japanese ceramics, lacquerwork, and metalwork. The glass preserved in that treasury in Nara, treasures donated by an empress in the 8th century, represents the appreciation of glass as an exotic import, rather than as a local product. The collection includes not only Persian cut glass vessels, but also Chinese glass objects and items from Southeast Asia, creating a remarkable snapshot of the glass trade across Asia in the 8th century. The building itself, with walls that expand and contract with humidity to naturally regulate the internal climate, has preserved these fragile objects in remarkably good condition for more than 1,000 years. The question of why East Asian civilizations, with all their technological brilliance, never developed glass to the same extent as the West has been debated by scholars for decades. The most convincing answer is not a lack of ability, but a difference in preference. China, Korea, and Japan had ceramics that were far superior to anything the West could produce, and they had cultural traditions that elevated jade, porcelain, and lacquer to the status of supreme materials. Glass simply offered little that these existing materials could not provide better. This difference would have important consequences when European expansion eventually brought Western glass technology to East Asia in the 16th and 17th centuries. European glass, particularly lenses and mirrors, offered something that East Asian materials genuinely could not replicate: the ability to manipulate light. It was in optics, rather than in cups or decoration, that glass would finally prove its unique value to civilizations that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of clay. In 2021, a team of researchers published a rather remarkable finding. Glass beads recovered from sites in Western China had been traced, through careful chemical analysis, back to workshops in the Eastern Mediterranean. These tiny beads, some no larger than a grain of rice, had traveled thousands of miles from the shores of the Mediterranean to the heart of China during the first 1,000 years before the Common Era, long before the formal establishment of the Silk Road. They revealed the existence of an earlier web of exchange, a network along which small, precious objects moved from hand to hand through the grasslands and deserts of Central Asia, connecting civilizations that had no direct contact with each other. Glass was one of the most widely traded materials on the ancient and medieval trade routes that linked East and West. Its combination of beauty, portability, and high value relative to its weight made it an ideal commodity for long-distance trade. Glass objects have been found at archaeological sites along every major trade route in the ancient world, and their distribution maps the contours of ancient commerce with quiet precision. The Silk Road, that vast network of overland and maritime routes that connected the Mediterranean to China for nearly 2,000 years, was in many ways a glass highway. Roman glass, particularly distinctive patterned bowls popular in the 1st century of the Common Era, has been found at sites in China, having crossed Central Asia through a chain of exchanges that might have taken years or even decades to complete. In the opposite direction, Chinese silk and ceramics flowed westward, creating a two-way trade in which glass from the west traveled east, while other luxuries traveled west. The sea routes were equally important. Evidence from Southeast Asia shows that glass from India and the Middle East was being traded across the Indian Ocean from at least the 5th century before the Common Era. These maritime routes connected the glass workshops of the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian subcontinent to the markets of Southeast Asia and China, creating a waterborne glass trade that ran alongside the overland routes through Central Asia. India played an especially important role in the medieval glass bead trade. Indian glass beads, produced in workshops across the subcontinent, have been found at sites throughout sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. The majority of glass beads found in sub-Saharan Africa from before European contact have been traced to Indian or Sri Lankan origin. Chemical analysis has demonstrated sustained contact between the eastern coast of Africa and the western coast of India from the 9th to the 19th century. These beads, small enough to be threaded on a string and light enough to be carried in enormous quantities, served as a medium of exchange across the Indian Ocean world, functioning as a form of money in regions where coined currency was not used. The glass trade along the Silk Road was not merely a commercial story. It was a vehicle for cultural exchange, for the sharing of technology, and for artistic inspiration. When Chinese glassmakers encountered Western beads in the 5th century before the Common Era, they adapted the designs to create their own distinctive versions. When Japanese craftsmen received Persian glass vessels as diplomatic gifts, they preserved them as treasures that influenced local artistic traditions. When communities across Africa incorporated glass beads into their daily lives, they transformed a foreign material into a local symbol of status, identity, and spiritual meaning. Glass beads occupied a unique position in the global economy of the medieval period. They were small, durable, beautiful, and could be made in an almost infinite variety of colors, shapes, and patterns. They could be produced relatively cheaply in regions with advanced glass technology and traded at significant markups in regions without it. They were used as jewelry, as money, as markers of social rank, as components of religious practice, and as diplomatic gifts. The glass bead was, in many ways, the first truly global commodity, a product traded on every inhabited continent, whose distribution traces the full reach of the pre-modern connected world. The Silk Road glass trade also left traces in language. The word for glass in several Central Asian languages reflects the material's foreign origin, reinforcing the idea that glass was perceived as an exotic substance from distant lands. In China, early terms for glass often distinguished between domestic products and imported ones, reflecting an awareness that the finest glass came from the West. The decline of the Silk Road's overland routes in the 15th century redirected the glass trade to the sea. European glass, particularly from Venice, began flowing eastward through the ports of the Indian Ocean, while Chinese porcelain continued to dominate the westbound luxury trade. The age of European maritime exploration that followed would create entirely new patterns of glass trade, including one of the most devastating exchanges in human history: the use of European glass beads as currency in the Atlantic slave trade. In 1938, a farmer in southeastern Nigeria was digging a water tank in his compound when his shovel struck metal. What he uncovered would eventually be recognized as one of the most important archaeological finds in African history: a series of elaborate bronze castings, ivory carvings, and remarkably more than 165,000 glass and stone beads, buried with an elite figure sometime in the 9th or 10th century of the Common Era. The sheer volume of beads was staggering. Over 100,000 glass beads alone arranged around the body of a high-ranking individual in patterns that spoke of enormous wealth and elaborate ceremony. Chemical analysis of the beads revealed something even more striking. Some of them had been produced in the workshops of medieval Cairo, hundreds of miles away across the Sahara Desert. The presence of Egyptian glass in a Nigerian burial from the 9th century demonstrated the existence of a long-distance trade network connecting West Africa to the Mediterranean world through trans-Saharan commerce. The same types of beads appeared at other sites farther west, suggesting a widespread network of glass bead distribution linking multiple West African civilizations to North African and Mediterranean sources. Africa's relationship with glass is far richer and more complex than most histories acknowledge. While the continent is often portrayed as merely a consumer of glass made elsewhere, there is growing evidence that glass was also produced locally south of the Sahara. African communities were not passive recipients of foreign goods, but active participants in the glass economy, adapting imported materials and techniques to their own needs and traditions. Glass beads served extraordinarily diverse purposes in African societies. They were markers of social rank, with specific types, colors, and arrangements signaling position, age, gender, and community membership. They were part of religious and spiritual life, incorporated into shrines, objects used in divination and protective charms. They were forms of wealth that could be saved, displayed, and exchanged. And above all, they were money, serving as a medium of exchange in economies where coined currency was rare. In the Kingdom of Benin, in what is now Nigeria, beads were a visible symbol of the social order. The Oba, or king, controlled the supply of certain bead types and distributed especially valuable beads as marks of favor and prestige. Coral and glass beads adorned the elaborate costumes worn by the king and his court, and the right to wear certain beads was governed by law. The famous bronzes of Benin, those extraordinary cast metal plaques and sculptures, frequently depict figures wearing elaborate arrangements of beads, documenting the central role of these small glass objects in one of West Africa's greatest kingdoms. Farther south, the trading city of Great Zimbabwe, which flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries, was a major center of the glass bead trade along the Indian Ocean coast. Glass beads found at Great Zimbabwe and other sites in southeastern Africa have been traced to workshops in India, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. The vast stone enclosures of Great Zimbabwe, the largest ancient structures in sub-Saharan Africa, were built by a society whose wealth came partly from controlling the trade in gold and ivory with the coast, a trade in which glass beads served as one of the main forms of payment. The arrival of European traders on the African coast in the 15th century introduced a devastating new chapter. From that time onward, Europeans traded cheap glass beads manufactured in Venice and later in other European cities for West African ivory gold and most horrifically enslaved human beings. These trade beads became one of the primary currencies of the transatlantic slave trade. Beads were used as ballast in slave ships on the outbound voyage from Europe to Africa, then exchanged for human cargo. The economics of this trade were cruelly unequal. In Europe, glass beads could be produced cheaply in enormous quantities. In West Africa, where the same technology was rare, glass beads retained high value. European merchants exploited this difference systematically, flooding African markets with glass and creating a form of deliberate economic manipulation that transferred wealth from West Africa to Europe and slowly damaged the economic foundations of communities. Elaborately patterned beads from Venice, with their intricate designs of fused glass, were among the most commonly traded. The Venetian glass industry profited greatly from this trade, a fact that is rarely mentioned in accounts of Venice's celebrated glass tradition. The beautiful, colorful beads that are today collected as antiques carry within them a history of extraordinary violence and exploitation. Yet, it would be wrong to reduce Africa's glass story to one of suffering alone. African communities actively shaped their engagement with glass, incorporating foreign materials into local artistic and cultural traditions with creativity and resourcefulness. Glass beads were melted down and reworked. New types were created by combining imported materials, and the preferences of African buyers influenced what European manufacturers produced. The glass bead trade was not a one-way imposition but a complex, deeply unequal exchange between cultures, and one whose legacy is still visible across the African continent today. On a spring morning in the year 1144, an abbot of a royal abbey just north of Paris stood in the newly completed choir of his rebuilt church and watched as sunlight streamed through the tall colored windows he had commissioned. The light that fell across the stone floor was not ordinary daylight. It was filtered through panels of glass colored with metallic compounds, ruby red from copper, sapphire blue from cobalt, emerald green from iron, and it transformed the interior of the church into a space that seemed to glow with something beyond the everyday world. For this abbot, a man named Suga, the effect was not merely visual. It was, for him, deeply theological. Light itself, in his understanding, was a manifestation of the divine, and the colored glass windows that changed and softened it were instruments for lifting the human soul from the material world towards something higher. This idea that light was the primary way God made himself known in the physical world drew on centuries of Christian thought. And it was Suga who first envisioned the systematic use of stained glass windows to create what he described as a heavenly light, a light that represented the presence of God within the walls of the church. The techniques for making stained glass were documented by a German monk writing in the early 12th century, whose treatise on the arts remains the most important surviving manual of medieval craft techniques. He described how he had carefully studied glaziers and glass painters at work in order to provide detailed instructions for creating windows of, as he put it, inestimable beauty. The basic process began with the production of colored glass. Sand and wood ash were melted in a furnace, and powdered metallic compounds were added while the glass was still molten to produce specific colors. The molten glass was then either blown into a long cylinder, which was slit along its length and flattened into a sheet, or spun on an iron rod into a round disc. Both methods produced relatively small pieces of glass, which were then cut into shapes and assembled into the window design. The assembly was painstaking work. The design was first drawn at full scale on a whitewashed board. Individual pieces of colored glass were cut to match the shapes and painted details. Faces, hands, folds of cloth, and architectural elements were applied with a mixture of ground glass and metallic powder bound with a liquid medium. The painted glass was then heated in a kiln to fuse the paint permanently to the surface. Finally, the pieces were fitted together using strips of lead that held the glass in place while also creating the dark outlines that give stained glass its distinctive look. The great cathedrals of the Gothic period, from the 12th through the 15th century, were designed specifically to hold as much stained glass as possible. The revolutionary structural achievement of the pointed arch and the flying buttress allowed cathedral walls to be opened up into vast expanses of window, transforming buildings that had been dominated by thick stone into frameworks of stone and colored light. The interiors of these cathedrals were meant to be experienced primarily through their windows, and the glass was not merely decorative but the central artistic and spiritual feature of the entire building. Chartres Cathedral, completed in the 13th century, possesses what is widely considered the finest collection of medieval stained glass in existence. Its 167 windows cover an enormous area, illustrating stories from the Bible, the lives of saints, and scenes from everyday life. The windows are celebrated for the extraordinary quality of their blue glass, a deep, luminous shade that has never been precisely copied. The chapel of a French king, built in Paris in the 1340s to house precious relics, represents perhaps the most extreme expression of the Gothic vision of a building made of light. Its 15 towering windows, each many meters high, contain over 1,000 individual scenes. The effect of standing inside on a sunny day is overwhelming. The walls seem to dissolve into planes of colored light, and the boundary between the physical building and the spiritual realm it represents becomes almost impossible to sense. Can you picture that for a moment? Standing in a space where stone and glass seem to disappear, and all that remains is light. The stained glass windows of medieval Europe also served a practical purpose in education. In an era when most people could not read, the windows functioned as a kind of visual Bible, telling the stories of the faith in images that anyone could understand. The survival of these windows is itself remarkable. Wars, religious upheavals, natural disasters, and simple neglect have destroyed the vast majority. The Protestant Reformation brought waves of deliberate destruction, as reformers smashed windows they considered idolatrous. The French Revolution brought further damage. That a handful of sites still possess substantially complete programs of medieval glass is a testament to centuries of careful preservation, a quiet act of devotion from one generation to the next. And while these glowing windows graced the cathedrals of the powerful, a different kind of glass tradition was taking shape in the forests of northern Europe, a humbler story of everyday objects made by wandering craftsmen who followed the trees. Deep in the forests of medieval Germany, Bohemia, and the north of France, small columns of smoke rose above the treetops, marking the locations of temporary glass furnaces that produced a humble but essential material. This was forest glass, and it was the everyday glass of northern Europe for nearly 700 years. While the elite glassmakers of Venice produced delicate, crystal-clear vessels for the tables of princes, the forest glassmakers produced the practical, useful glass that ordinary people actually lived with: thick green drinking vessels, simple window panes, and the sturdy bottles that held wine, beer, and medicine. Forest glass was born of necessity. As European civilization expanded across the north and west around 800 of the Common Era, demand for glass increased, but the traditional ingredients used in Mediterranean glassmaking, particularly a mineral salt from Egyptian lake beds and ash from coastal plants, were expensive to transport to landlocked regions. The solution was wood ash, abundantly available in the heavily forested lands of Central and Northern Europe, which provided a suitable substitute for the Mediterranean ingredients. The resulting glass had a distinctive character. Its greenish-yellow color, caused by iron impurities in the local sand, and the potash from wood ash, became its signature. Early products were often rough, But over time, the forest glassmakers developed real skill, producing vessels of genuine beauty within the limits of their materials. The green tint that some drinkers found unappealing was, in practical terms, actually an advantage, as it made the glass slightly more resistant to decay than the clearer glass of the Mediterranean. The forest glass industry was organized around something very simple: the availability of fuel. A single glass furnace consumed enormous quantities of wood, and when the forests near a workshop had been stripped bare, the entire operation simply moved to a new location. This pattern of moving from place to place shaped the social character of the industry. The glassmakers were wandering craftsmen, setting up temporary workshops in the forests of Bohemia, the Black Forest, and Normandy, that might operate for a few years or a few decades before the surrounding timber was used up. Can you picture that life for a moment? A small community of glassmakers, their families and their apprentices, living at the edge of the forest beside a furnace that burned day and night, producing green-tinted glass that would find its way into the homes and taverns of the countryside. When the trees grew thin, they would pack up and move on, find a new stretch of forest, build a new furnace, and begin again. It was a life both itinerant and deeply skilled. The earliest innovations in forest glass production were closely tied to monasteries, which had both the literacy to record technical knowledge and the resources to invest in experimental work. Monasteries also provided a ready market for glass, particularly for the stained glass windows that were becoming an increasingly important feature of church architecture. As demand grew, the industry expanded beyond monastic control, and independent master glassmakers set up their own workshops, often negotiating with local landowners for the right to harvest timber and operate furnaces on their land. The region of Bohemia, in what is now the Czech Republic, emerged as a center of excellence within this tradition. While other regions produced mainly the standard greenish glass, Bohemian glassmakers learned to produce clear glass as well, a significant achievement that set their work apart. They also mastered the art of adding metallic compounds to produce blue, red, and other colors. By the 14th century, Bohemian glass was being sold across Europe, and the foundations were being laid for the Czech glass tradition that continues to this day. The two main methods for making flat window glass in Northern Europe were the broadsheet method and the crown glass method. In the broadsheet method, a glassblower produced a large cylinder by blowing a bubble and swinging it to elongate it, then cutting the cylinder open and flattening it while still hot. In the crown method, a blob of molten glass was spun on the end of an iron rod until centrifugal force flattened it into a disc. The center of the disc, where the rod had been attached, formed a distinctive raised bump called the bullseye, a feature that became characteristic of medieval window glass and can still be seen in the windows of surviving old buildings. Neither method produced perfectly flat, clear glass. The sheets had a characteristic waviness that distorted the view and gave old glass its distinctive, slightly liquid appearance. These imperfections, which visitors to historic buildings sometimes mistake for evidence that old glass has slowly flowed over centuries, are simply marks of the way the glass was made. Glass, despite what you may have heard, does not flow at room temperature. The forest glass tradition gradually faded in the 17th and 18th centuries as improvements in transportation made it affordable to ship Mediterranean ingredients to northern workshops, and as coal began to replace wood as a fuel source. But the legacy of this tradition persists in the green glass bottles still used for wine and beer, in the deep green color that many people instinctively associate with glass, and in the glass-making traditions of Bohemia and other Central European regions that trace their origins back to those smoky forest furnaces of the Middle Ages. And while these wandering craftsmen were producing their humble wares in the northern woods, a very different story was unfolding on a small island in the Venetian lagoon, a story of genius, imprisonment, and the most closely guarded secrets in Europe. On a day in 1291 that would reshape the history of glass forever, the governing council of the Venetian Republic issued a decree ordering all glass furnaces within the city of Venice to be moved to the nearby island of Murano. The official reason was practical enough. the furnaces posed a fire hazard to Venice's densely packed wooden buildings. But the real motivation was something far more calculated. By concentrating every glassmaker on a single small island, the Republic could watch, control, and protect its most valuable industrial secret. Murano was to become the world's most exclusive workshop, a gilded cage for the artisans who produced the finest glass on Earth. The Venetian glass industry had been growing for centuries before this decree, nourished by Venice's position as the commercial bridge between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. Venetian merchants had long traded with Egypt and Syria, where the traditions of Roman and Islamic glassmaking still flourished, and they brought back not only finished glass but also knowledge of techniques and, sometimes, the craftsmen themselves. Venice absorbed these influences and transformed them into something distinctly its own. By 1295, just 4 years after the relocation, the Republic had added a further restriction. Glassworkers on Murano were forbidden from leaving the island without official permission, and the penalty for revealing glass trade secrets to foreign powers was death. These were not idle threats. The Venetian state took the protection of its glass industry with lethal seriousness, and there are documented cases of agents being sent to pursue, and in some instances to kill, glassmakers who attempted to flee to rival states. Yet life on Murano was not entirely a prison. The glassmakers occupied a peculiar social position, simultaneously captive and privileged. They were granted rights denied to most Venetian citizens. Their daughters could marry into the nobility. They were exempt from certain taxes. They enjoyed a standard of living that reflected the extraordinary value the Republic placed on their skills. The master glassmakers of Murano were, in effect, a craft aristocracy, honored and pampered, but watched and controlled. It was within this strange environment of captive creativity that a glassmaker named Angelo Barovia achieved the breakthrough that would define Venetian glass for centuries. Around 1450, Barovia developed a method of purifying his ingredients to an extraordinary degree, combining quartz powder ground from river pebbles with carefully processed plant ash, and adding a substance to remove the greenish tint that had colored all glass up to that point. The result was something the world had never seen before, a glass so transparent and colorless that it resembled natural rock crystal. He called it Cristallo, and it changed European taste forever. For the first time, glass could be valued not as a colored imitation of precious stones, but for its own intrinsic quality of transparency. Venetian glassmakers exploited this clarity to produce vessels of extraordinary delicacy, blown to an almost impossible thinness, their walls no thicker than paper. The fragility of these vessels was part of their appeal, a demonstration of supreme skill and a symbol of the owner's wealth. Venetian Cristallo goblets, decorated with gilding and applied glass threads, became the most sought-after tableware in Europe, displayed on the tables of kings, popes, and princes. The Murano glassmakers also developed a range of specialty products that kept Venice at the forefront of the European glass market. They created glass with intricate patterns of fused colored rods, glass with spiraling threads of white or colored glass woven through clear vessels to create lace-like effects, and mirrors backed with a reflecting layer of tin and mercury that were the clearest and most accurate available anywhere. These mirrors were sometimes valued by weight at the same rate as gold. The Republic's control over its industry was maintained through an elaborate system of regulation and surveillance. A guild charter governed every aspect of production on Murano, from the hours furnaces could operate to the types of glass that could be made. Raw material suppliers were carefully vetted. Waste glass was collected and recycled to prevent anyone from analyzing the compositions. And every visiting foreigner on the island was regarded with suspicion. Despite all these measures, the secrets of Murano did not remain on the island forever. The very quality that made these glassmakers so valuable to Venice also made them irresistible targets for recruitment by foreign powers. Throughout the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, a steady stream of Murano craftsmen defied the Republic's prohibitions and fled to establish workshops in other countries, carrying with them the technical knowledge that Venice had guarded so jealously. Some were lured by the promise of wealth and titles, others by elaborate espionage operations, and a few were simply driven by the desire for freedom. The story of Venice and Murano is one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of any craft. For more than 500 years, a small island in a lagoon was the most important center of glass production in the Western world, a place where art, science, commerce, and political control converged around a single material. And on that island, workshops still operate today, producing hand-blown glass using techniques that Angelo Baravier would recognize in a tradition passed from master to apprentice for more than 7 centuries. In the autumn of 1665, the powerful finance minister of King Louis XIV of France sent a carefully worded letter to the French ambassador in Venice. The instructions were delicate but unmistakable. The ambassador was to go to the island of Murano and discreetly recruit a team of master glassworkers, tempting them with generous salaries and the promise of privileged status in France. The mission was industrial espionage of the highest order, a state-sponsored operation to steal the most jealously guarded craft secrets in Europe. The minister knew that Venice had threatened death to any glassmaker who revealed its secrets, but France needed mirrors, and the finest mirrors in the world came from Murano. The campaign was audacious, and it succeeded. French agents managed to recruit a small group of mirror makers and smuggle them out of Venice to Paris, where they were installed in a workshop and set to producing mirrors using Venetian techniques. The Venetian government was furious, and diplomatic protests flew between the two states. According to some accounts, Venetian agents poisoned or attempted to poison several of the defectors, sending a chilling message to any other craftsman who might be tempted to leave. But the damage was done. France now possessed the knowledge to produce mirrors that rivaled the finest in the world. Within 15 years, the king had unveiled the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, a room containing 357 mirrors that would become one of the most famous interiors in the world. Each mirror panel was the largest that the technology of the day could produce, and together they created an effect of overwhelming luxury and seemingly infinite space. The hall announced to the world that France had broken Venice's monopoly and could now produce glass of equal quality on its own soil. The workshop established for this purpose would eventually become one of the oldest glass companies still in operation today. France was not the only European power that sought to break Venice's grip on the glass trade. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, defecting Venetian glassmakers established workshops across the continent, carrying their skills to the Netherlands, Spain, the Austrian Empire, and England. Some were recruited through diplomatic channels. Others simply chose to leave, accepting the risk of Venetian retribution in exchange for the chance to work independently. A rival Italian glass center near Genoa also helped spread Venetian techniques by sending its own craftsmen abroad without the same severe restrictions. In England, the most significant development was the invention of a new type of glass by a London businessman named George Ravenscroft in 1674. Ravenscroft experimented extensively with adding lead to the glass recipe, producing a material that was not only more durable than Venetian glass, but also more brilliant, with an inner sparkle that made it flash and glitter in candlelight. This lead crystal glass quickly became the preferred material for fine tableware in England, and eventually across much of Europe. The story of Ravenscroft's work is itself touched by the international flow of glass knowledge. A Venetian glassmaking expert visited him for a brief period, and while the exact details of their exchange are not recorded, the timing suggests that Venetian expertise may have played a part in the breakthrough, even if the final innovation, the systematic use of lead, was distinctly English. The gradual erosion of Venice's glass monopoly over these 2 centuries is a story of technology spreading through a combination of spying, defection, imitation, and independent invention. Each European country that acquired Venetian techniques adapted them to its own traditions and local materials, producing distinctive regional styles. French mirror glass, English lead crystal, Bohemian cut glass, Dutch engraved glass, and Spanish patterned glass all descended, directly or indirectly, from the traditions of Murano, but each developed its own character and identity. The loss of its monopoly did not destroy Murano's glass industry, but it did end its dominance. By the 18th century, the creative center of European glass had shifted away from Venice toward Bohemia, England, and France. The industry that had been concentrated on a single island for centuries had become a truly continental enterprise. There is a broader lesson here that echoes through the history of technology. Trade secrets, no matter how zealously guarded, eventually find their way out. The knowledge of how to make things, once it exists in human minds, tends to spread, flowing from centers of innovation to the wider world through channels that no government, however determined, can permanently control. Venice's glass secrets, like China's porcelain secrets and Britain's industrial secrets, were eventually shared with the world, not because their guardians chose to share them, but because human knowledge is inherently difficult to contain. And among all the secrets that escaped Murano, perhaps the most consequential was the art of making mirrors, objects that would quietly reshape how human beings understood themselves. For most of human history, people had only the vaguest idea of what they looked like. A still pool of water on a windless day, a polished piece of obsidian, a hammered disc of bronze. These were the only mirrors available, and they offered reflections that were dim, distorted, and incomplete. Then, sometime in the late 13th or early 14th century, glassmakers in Venice discovered that by coating the back of a flat piece of glass with a thin layer of tin and mercury, they could produce a reflection of startling clarity. For the first time in all of history, a person could see their own face as others saw it. The earliest glass mirrors were small, often slightly curved, and gave somewhat distorted reflections. But by the 15th century, Venetian mirror makers on Murano had perfected the technique of producing flat glass mirrors backed with a tin-mercury mixture that was carefully spread across the surface and pressed smooth. The process required extraordinary skill and patience. The mercury mixture was difficult to work with, and producing a mirror with an even, unblemished, reflective surface was an achievement that few workshops could manage consistently. Venice held a near monopoly on mirror production for several centuries, and during this time, mirrors were among the most expensive luxury items in Europe. A fine Venetian mirror could cost more than a painting by a celebrated artist. They were listed in royal inventories alongside jewelry and precious metalwork, and given as diplomatic gifts between heads of state. When the French ambassador presented a mirror to a queen, it was considered a gift of extraordinary significance. The impact of the glass mirror on society is difficult to overstate. Before mirrors, self-knowledge was primarily internal, based on how one felt rather than how one looked. The mirror made self-perception external, creating an image that could be studied, evaluated, and compared to the standards of the time. Art historians have noted that the development of realistic portraiture in European painting accelerated after mirrors became widely available, as artists could for the first time study their own faces in detail. The mirror also transformed the way people designed the insides of their homes. Mirrors placed opposite windows doubled the apparent light in a room. Mirrors at the end of corridors created the illusion of infinite space. The deliberate use of mirrors in palaces and great houses, reaching its peak in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, made the glass mirror one of the defining elements of European interior design for centuries. But the beauty of mirrors came at a terrible human cost. The mercury tin process that produced the finest reflections was lethally toxic to the workers who practiced it. Mercury vapor breathed in day after day in the enclosed workshops of Murano caused tremors, memory loss, mood disturbances, kidney damage, and eventually madness and death. The mirror makers of Murano, who produced the most beautiful reflections in the world, were slowly poisoned by the very substance that made their work possible. The dangers were well known but accepted as the price of production. Guild records from Murano document high rates of illness and early death among mirror workers, and the neighborhoods where mirror making was concentrated had reputations for disease that persisted for generations. The scientific understanding of mercury poisoning would not come until much later, but the connection between the work and the suffering was plain enough to anyone who looked. The development of a new method of backing mirrors by a German chemist in 1835 eventually solved the mercury problem. He discovered how to deposit a thin, even layer of metallic silver onto a glass surface using a chemical reaction, creating what we now think of as the modern mirror. This process was not only safer than the mercury method, but also faster, cheaper, and more reliable. Within a few decades, silver-backed mirrors had replaced mercury mirrors entirely, and the price of mirrors fell dramatically. They transformed from luxury items reserved for the wealthy into everyday objects found in every home. The spread of affordable mirrors had deep cultural consequences. For the first time, ordinary people could see themselves clearly, and the mirror became a fixture in every bedroom, every bathroom, every barbershop. It changed how people dressed, how they groomed themselves, how they presented themselves to the world. It created new forms of self-awareness and new anxieties about appearance. Today, mirrors are so ordinary that their revolutionary nature has become invisible. But every time you glance at your own reflection, you are engaging with a technology that was, for most of human history, either impossible or far too expensive for common use. The glass mirror is one of the quietest revolutions in the history of civilization, a transformation so complete that it is now impossible to imagine life without it. And the same material that allowed humanity to see its own face would soon be shaped into another form, one that would extend not self-knowledge, but the productive life of every scholar and craftsman in Europe. Sometime around 1286, in a workshop in northern Italy, most likely near the cities of Pisa or Florence, an unknown craftsman mounted two small curved glass lenses into a frame, probably made of bone or wood, and created an object that would quietly change the course of civilization. These first spectacles were simple devices, two magnifying lenses riveted together at their handles, designed to be balanced on the nose. They had no side pieces to hook over the ears. That refinement would come centuries later, and they had to be held in place by hand. They were uncomfortable, awkward, and available only to the fortunate few who could afford them. But they allowed aging scholars, scribes, and craftsmen to see clearly again, and in doing so, they may have doubled the intellectual output of literate civilization. Before spectacles, the gradual loss of near vision that affects virtually everyone past the age of 40 effectively ended the career of anyone whose work required close reading or fine manual labor. Monks who had spent decades copying manuscripts found that, by their mid-40s, they could no longer make out the letters on the page. Scholars could no longer read the texts they studied. Craftsmen could no longer execute the detailed work their trades demanded. The loss of these experienced, highly skilled people represented an enormous drain on the productive capacity of medieval society. The invention had been anticipated by centuries of experimentation with glass lenses. The great scholar of optics working in Cairo in the early 11th century had discussed the magnifying properties of curved glass in his groundbreaking work on light and vision. His ideas, translated into Latin in the 12th century, introduced European thinkers to the science behind magnification. Meanwhile, monks who spent hours copying texts were among the first to use what were called reading stones, polished half-spheres of glass or clear crystal placed directly on the page to enlarge the letters beneath. These primitive magnifying tools provided enlargement but were cumbersome as they had to be slid across the page line by line. The leap from reading stone to spectacle was technically small but practically enormous. By mounting two lenses in a frame that sat on the nose, the spectacle freed both hands for work and provided continuous enlargement of the entire field of vision. The identity of the inventor has been debated for centuries. A memorial in Florence long credited a local man, but that attribution has been shown to be a later invention. A monk in Pisa is recorded as having learned to make spectacles and sharing the knowledge generously, but he may have been reproducing someone else's design. The true inventor remains anonymous. What is clear is that spectacles spread across Europe with remarkable speed. By the early 1300s, records document their presence in Parisian universities, English monasteries, and German trade centers. The technology was simple enough that any competent craftsman who understood the basic principle could produce a pair, and merchants traveling between Italy and Northern Europe carried spectacles as trade goods. Venice, with its established glass industry, quickly became a major producer of lenses. The effect on intellectual productivity was recognized almost immediately. A contemporary noted that the invention would enable aging men in teaching, law, banking, and commerce to keep actively at work longer than would otherwise have been possible. This practical extension of working life had consequences that rippled far beyond the individual. By keeping experienced scholars, administrators, and craftsmen productive for an additional decade or more, spectacles increased the total amount of skilled labor available to society at any given time. The connection between spectacles and the printing revolution of the 15th century is worth pausing on. The inventor of movable type printing was himself an aging craftsman who would have benefited from spectacles, and many of the printers, typesetters, and proofreaders who operated the new presses were men of an age where near vision would have been failing without corrective lenses. The explosion of printed books in the late 1400s created an unprecedented demand for reading glasses, as a newly literate population needed them to read the books that the printing press was making available for the first time. Spectacles for people who could not see distant objects using differently shaped lenses appeared later, probably in the 15th century. The development of glasses that combined both types of lenses in a single pair is traditionally credited to Benjamin Franklin in the 1780s. But long before these refinements, the basic spectacle with its magnifying lenses had already transformed the relationship between age and productivity, between human biology and human achievement. It was glass shaped into two small curves and mounted on the nose that allowed civilization to extend the useful years of its most valuable minds. And it would not be long before another arrangement of glass lenses placed not on the nose but at the end of a tube would extend human vision not just to the page but all the way to the stars. On the 2nd of October 1608, a Dutch spectacle maker named Hans Lippershey walked into the offices of his government in The Hague and filed a patent for a device he described as an instrument for seeing things far away as if they were nearby. The invention was elegant in its simplicity. Two glass lenses mounted at either end of a tube, one curved outward and one curved inward, arranged so that distant objects appeared magnified by a factor of 3. The officials, recognizing the military possibilities, declined to grant a patent on the grounds that the idea was already too widely known, but they paid him 900 florins and asked him to build more. Lippershey was not the only Dutch lens maker to claim the invention. Two other craftsmen filed similar claims within weeks of each other, suggesting that the telescope was one of those innovations that was, in some sense, waiting to happen, an idea whose time had come in a country already full of people who spent their days grinding and polishing glass lenses. The spectacle-making industry of the Netherlands had created a generation of craftsmen intimately familiar with how glass bends light, and it was perhaps only a matter of time before someone discovered the magnifying effect of placing two lenses in a line. But it was an Italian, not a Dutchman, who would transform this optical curiosity into a world-changing instrument of science. Galileo Galilei, a professor of mathematics at the University of Padua, heard about the Dutch invention in the middle of 1609 and immediately set about building his own version. Starting with a telescope of 3 times magnification, he rapidly improved his designs, producing instruments that magnified 8 times, then 20 times, then 23 times. His most powerful telescope was nearly a meter long, a remarkable achievement given the imperfect glass available and the absence of any theory of how lenses should be shaped. In January of 1610, Galileo pointed his telescope at the planet Jupiter and saw what he initially took to be three small, previously unknown stars arranged in a line near the planet. Over the following nights, he watched as these stars moved, and within days he had reached a startling conclusion. They were not stars at all, but moons circling Jupiter. He had discovered the first objects known to orbit a planet other than Earth, a finding that struck directly at the ancient belief that everything in the heavens revolved around us. The implications were profound. If Jupiter could have moons of its own, then Earth was not the sole center of all cosmic motion, and the old model of the universe, which placed our world immovably at the center, was wrong. In March of 1610, Galileo published his observations in a short book that traveled rapidly to every corner of learned Europe and set off a revolution in how people understood the heavens. Galileo's telescope revealed far more than the moons of Jupiter. He saw that the moon was not the smooth, perfect sphere that ancient philosophy demanded, but a rough, cratered landscape of mountains and valleys. He saw that the pale band of the Milky Way was composed of countless individual stars. He observed that Venus went through phases like the moon, a phenomenon that could only be explained if Venus orbited the Sun rather than the Earth. Each observation chipped away at the foundations of the old understanding and added weight to the idea that the Sun, not the Earth, stood at the center of things. The telescope was glass's most revolutionary child. A simple arrangement of two curved pieces of glass in a tube had overturned thousands of years of belief, created the discipline of observational astronomy, and fundamentally changed humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. The material that ancient craftsmen had first produced as decorative beads was now being used to peer into the depths of space. Later in the same century, Isaac Newton recognized a fundamental limitation of these early telescopes. Because glass bends different colors of light by slightly different amounts, the images they produced were surrounded by colored fringes. Newton's solution was to replace the glass lens with a curved mirror, made from a polished metal alloy that reflected and focused light without splitting it into colors. His first reflecting telescope, completed in 1668, was small enough to hold in one hand, but it demonstrated a principle that would eventually lead to the enormous observatory telescopes of modern times, with mirrors measured in meters that can gather light from galaxies unimaginably far away. Whether made with lenses or mirrors, every telescope that has ever been pointed at the sky owes its existence to the properties of glass, its ability to be shaped into curves, its transparency, and its hardness. Glass made the universe visible, and in doing so, it changed everything we thought we knew about where and what we are. In the autumn of 1674, a Dutch cloth merchant named Anthony van Leeuwenhoek sat in his workshop in the city of Delft, peering through a tiny glass lens he had ground and polished himself, and saw something that no human being had ever seen before. In a drop of lake water, magnified perhaps 200 times, he observed what he described as very little living creatures, tiny beings swimming, spinning and darting across his field of view. Van Leeuwenhoek had discovered a hidden kingdom of life, an entire world of organisms that had been invisible to every previous generation, hidden in the water people drank, the food they ate, and the air they breathed. Van Leeuwenhoek was not a scientist by training. He was a textile merchant who had learned to grind lenses as a way to examine the quality of cloth, inspecting individual fibers and the tightness of the weave. But his obsessive dedication to lens grinding produced instruments of extraordinary quality. Rather than using microscopes with multiple lenses, which were already available but produced blurry images, he built simple microscopes consisting of a single tiny, perfectly ground bead of glass. His best lenses could magnify up to 275 times, and this level of power would not be surpassed by more complex instruments for over a century. His inspiration came partly from an English thinker named Robert Hooke, whose illustrated book on microscopy, published in 1665, had created a sensation across Europe. This book was the first major work to show what could be seen through a microscope, and its detailed drawings of a flea's leg, the eye of a fly, the structure of cork, and the edge of a razor blade revealed a previously invisible world of astonishing detail. The book became one of the first scientific works to be widely read by a general audience, and it sparked enormous public interest in what tiny lenses could reveal. Hooke's most famous observation was of thin slices of cork, in which he noticed small, regular compartments that reminded him of the rooms where monks lived. He used the word cell to describe them, accidentally coining a term that would become one of the most fundamental concepts in all of biology. What Hooke saw were actually the empty walls of dead plant tissue, but the name he chose would eventually be applied to the basic building block of all living things. While Hooke was primarily interested in the structure of visible objects, van Leeuwenhoek went further, turning his lenses on materials that the naked eye could not meaningfully examine at all. Over nearly 50 years, he wrote hundreds of letters to the Royal Society of London describing what he saw: tiny organisms in pond water, even tinier organisms in dental plaque, the cells flowing through tiny blood vessels. Each letter revealed another layer of the invisible world, expanding the boundaries of human knowledge with every observation. The Royal Society, initially doubtful, sent a group to Delft to check his claims. They came away convinced and elected him a fellow, an extraordinary honor for a man with no formal education and no connection to the established scientific world. His achievement showed that the most important quality for scientific discovery was not academic credentials, but patient, careful observation and the right piece of glass. Van Leeuwenhoek was fiercely protective of his lens grinding techniques. He built over 500 microscopes during his lifetime, but never revealed his methods. And when he died at the age of 90 in 1723, his secrets died with him. It was not until the 20th century that study of his surviving instruments revealed the remarkable precision of his lenses. Some scholars believe he did not grind his lenses at all, but drew them from thin rods of glass melted in a flame, a technique that can produce nearly perfect tiny spheres. Whatever his method, the results were unmatched for more than a century. The importance of what van Leeuwenhoek discovered was not immediately grasped. The idea that invisible living creatures could cause disease in humans would not be developed for another 200 years. But the simple fact that these organisms existed everywhere, in every drop of water, in every sample of soil, in every human body, fundamentally changed how we understand the natural world. The universe, it turned out, was not only vastly larger than anyone had imagined as the telescope had shown, but also infinitely smaller. The microscope's eventual impact on medicine and public health has been beyond measure. The identification of disease-causing organisms, the development of vaccines and antibiotics, the entire field of microbiology, all depended on the ability to see things too small for the naked eye, an ability that existed only because of glass lenses. Together, the telescope and the microscope represent the two great expansions of human sight that glass made possible. One extended vision outward to the most distant objects in the cosmos, and the other extended it inward to the smallest structures of life. Both were products of the same material and the same principle, that curved glass can bend light to reveal what the unaided eye cannot see. And between them, they expanded the knowable universe by orders of magnitude, transforming glass from a decorative material into the essential instrument of science itself. In the cluttered laboratory of the man who would be called the father of modern chemistry, glass was everywhere. Glass vessels curved like the necks of swans. Glass jars trapped gases for measurement. Glass tubes connected pieces of equipment in intricate networks. Glass flasks held the substances that would prove, once and for all, that burning was a chemical reaction involving a specific element in the air, rather than the release of some mysterious invisible substance. When Antoine-Laurent Lavoisier conducted the precise experiments that revolutionized chemistry in the 1770s and 1780s, he did so using equipment that was almost entirely made of glass. and the accuracy of his results depended directly on the quality of that glass. The relationship between glass and science is so intimate that it is easy to forget how remarkable it is. Modern chemistry, biology, physics, and medicine are all practiced using glass equipment, from the simplest test tube to the most complex analytical instrument. Glass is used because it possesses a combination of qualities that no other material can match. It is transparent, allowing the scientist to see what is happening inside the vessel. It does not react with the substances it holds, meaning it does not contaminate the experiment. It does not absorb anything, preventing residues from past experiments from affecting new ones. It can withstand considerable heat, and it can be shaped by a skilled glass worker into virtually any form that an experiment requires. The alchemists who came before modern chemists were themselves dependent on glass. The distinctive flask with a long curved neck used for distillation was a glass instrument refined by Islamic alchemists and passed to Europe during the medieval period. Through these vessels, the alchemists distilled alcohol, strong acids, and plant essences, developing practical chemical techniques that would eventually form the foundation of modern chemistry, even as their dream of turning common metals into gold proved to be an impossibility. The very word for that curved flask comes from the Arabic language, tracing the transmission of glass chemical technology from the ancient Mediterranean through the Islamic world to medieval Europe. But the glass available to these early experimenters was far from perfect. Ordinary glass, the same basic material that had been used since ancient times, tended to crack when heated and cooled too quickly. It could be slowly eaten away by strong acids and alkalis, contaminating the very substances it was supposed to contain. And it was difficult to work into the complicated shapes that sophisticated experiments required. The transformation of scientific glass came from an unlikely partnership in a German city in the 1880s. A young glassmaker named Otto Schott moved to the city of Jena and joined forces with a physicist named Ernst Abbe, who was frustrated by the poor quality of glass available for scientific instruments, particularly the lenses used in microscopes. Schott brought a systematic, scientific approach to glass composition, experimenting methodically with different combinations of ingredients to create glasses with specific, predictable quality. The result of their collaboration was a new type of glass in which a significant portion of the traditional ingredient was replaced by a compound containing the element boron. This new glass had a dramatically lower tendency to expand and contract with changes in temperature, making it far less likely to crack when heated and cooled. It could be subjected to rapid temperature changes without shattering, a quality that made it perfectly suited for laboratory use. Schott founded a company in Jena and over the following years developed the formulations that would become the foundation of modern scientific and industrial glass. An American glass company introduced its own version of this heat-resistant glass in 1915 under a brand name that quickly became a household word. The story of its development includes a charming domestic experiment. A physicist at the company suspected that the new glass was durable enough for cooking. His wife tested this idea by baking a cake in a glass pan, which came out perfectly. This kitchen experiment led to a line of glass bakeware that brought heat-resistant glass out of the laboratory and into millions of homes where people used it for everything from casseroles to measuring cups. The impact of scientific glass on human knowledge is beyond calculation. Without glass beakers, flasks, and tubes, the experiments that revealed the structure of the atom, the nature of the molecule that carries our genetic code, and the mechanisms of disease could not have been performed. Without glass lenses, the microscopes and telescopes that extended human vision could not have been built. Glass, the material that potters in Mesopotamia stumbled upon by accident 5,000 years ago, became the indispensable tool of the scientific revolution and remains so to this day. And while science was transforming what glass could reveal, a far humbler application of glass was quietly transforming how the world stored and consumed its food, its drinks, and its medicine. In the year 1662, An English merchant and scientist stood before the Royal Society in London and described something that the French would later claim as their own invention, the deliberate addition of sugar to wine to produce a sparkling, bubbly drink. But what made this possible was not the sugar or the yeast. It was the bottle. English glassmakers, burning coal instead of wood in their furnaces, had developed glass that was far stronger and thicker than anything produced on the continent. Without these sturdy English bottles, capable of withstanding the enormous pressure of carbonation, sparkling wine would have remained an accident rather than an art. The glass bottle is one of those inventions so commonplace that its power to transform daily life is easy to miss. Before reliable glass bottles, liquids were stored in ceramic jugs, leather skins, wooden barrels, and metal flasks, all of which either reacted with their contents, leaked, or failed to keep things fresh. Wine in wooden barrels turned to vinegar within months. Aberdasines in ceramic vessels absorbed tastes and impurities from whatever had been stored in them before. Beer in leather containers picked up the flavor of the animal hide. Glass solved all these problems at once. It was watertight, it did not react with what was inside, and it was transparent, allowing the drinker to see what they were about to consume and the pharmacist to check the contents of a prescription. The history of glass bottles stretches back to Roman times, when small blown bottles held perfumes and ointments. But Roman glass was thin and fragile, and these were luxury items rather than everyday containers. It was not until the 17th century that bottles strong enough for practical storage of wine, beer, and spirits became available, thanks to the coal-fired furnace and the denser, darker glass it produced. The evolution of the wine bottle tells a quiet story of clever engineering. The earliest wine bottles, produced in the 1630s and 1640s, were squat, broad-bodied vessels with long necks, shaped rather like onions. Over the following century, the bottle gradually stretched upward, passing through a mallet-shaped phase before arriving at the tall, cylindrical form we recognize today. This change was not about looks, but about function. The cylindrical bottle could be stored on its side, which meant the cork stayed in contact with the wine, remaining moist and keeping an airtight seal. This simple change in shape made the long-term aging of wine possible for the first time, transforming wine from a drink that had to be consumed quickly into one that could improve over decades in the cellar. The relationship between glass bottles and champagne is especially intimate. The monk who is traditionally credited with refining champagne production understood that the enormous pressure inside a bottle of sparkling wine, roughly 3 times the pressure in a car tire, demanded a bottle of exceptional strength. Ordinary bottles exploded with alarming regularity, and in some cellars losses of half the stock were common. Workers in champagne cellars wore iron masks to protect their faces from flying glass. The adoption of thick, dark green English-style glass, combined with securely fastened corks, gradually reduced these losses and made champagne production commercially possible. The dark green color of wine and champagne bottles is not merely decorative. Glass of this color filters out light that would otherwise damage the wine by breaking down certain compounds and creating unpleasant flavors. The choice of dark glass for wine bottles is an ancient piece of practical wisdom that modern science has confirmed. The apothecary bottle represents another important chapter in this story. For centuries, pharmacies were lined with rows of glass bottles and jars, each containing a different medicine, herb, or preparation. The standardization of medicine bottle shapes became a matter of life and death. Poison bottles, for example, were deliberately made in unusual shapes with raised bumps or ridges that could be felt in the dark, so that a person reaching for medicine at night would not accidentally drink something deadly. Perhaps no glass bottle in history is more recognizable than the one designed for a famous soft drink in 1915. A company in Indiana won a competition to create a bottle so distinctive that it could be recognized by feel alone, even in the dark or when broken on the ground. The resulting design, with its elongated ridges and distinctive curve, became one of the most recognized commercial objects in the world. It showed that a glass container could become more than a vessel. It could become a symbol, an icon, and a work of industrial design. The glass bottle's long reign as the world's dominant beverage container lasted for centuries before facing serious competition in the mid-20th century from metal cans and plastic containers. Plastic was lighter, cheaper, and nearly unbreakable, advantages that seemed overwhelming at first. Yet, glass has never been entirely displaced, and in recent years there has been a notable return of interest in glass bottles, driven by concerns about plastic pollution and the superior recyclability of glass. The glass bottle, one of the oldest manufactured containers in the world, may yet prove more enduring than the plastic that was supposed to replace it. On a rainy November morning in 1850, a gardener named Joseph Paxton sat in a meeting and sketched an idea on a piece of blotting paper. The sketch showed a vast building made entirely of glass and iron, a structure unlike anything the world had ever seen. Paxton was not an architect. He was the head gardener for a wealthy duke, a man who had spent decades designing greenhouses for growing tropical plants in the English climate. But it was precisely this experience with glass structures that qualified him to solve a problem that had defeated every professional architect in Britain: how to build a hall large enough to house the Great Exhibition of 1851, the world's first international fair in London's Hyde Park. His design was revolutionary. The building, which came to be called the Crystal Palace, was over 1,800 feet long, made from nearly 300,000 identical panes of glass covering an enormous area. It was the first modular building in history, with every component made off-site and assembled by thousands of workers in just 39 weeks. When Queen Victoria opened the exhibition on the 1st of May, 1851, she entered a building that seemed to be made of light itself, a cathedral of glass that announced more powerfully than any speech that architecture would never be the same. But the Crystal Palace was the peak of a story that had begun nearly 2,000 years earlier. For most of human history, a window was simply a hole in a wall covered with oiled cloth, scraped animal skin, or wooden shutters to keep out the weather while letting in some dim light. The Roman Empire produced the first window glass, flat sheets that have been found in the ruins of Pompeii. These Roman windows were not transparent in the way we understand the word. They were cloudy, letting light pass through but remaining too hazy to see through clearly. Still, they were a remarkable innovation. For the first time, a building could let in daylight while keeping out wind, rain, and cold. After the fall of Rome, glass windows became rare in most of Europe. Only churches and the grandest buildings could afford them. Medieval window glass was made by either spinning molten glass into a disc or blowing a cylinder and flattening it, methods that produced wavy, uneven panes full of imperfections. But even imperfect glass was a revelation for a world accustomed to living in near darkness through the winter months. Glass windows changed the inside experience of buildings in ways that are hard to appreciate from the perspective of our glass-filled world. Buildings without glass were dark, cold, and damp in winter. Glass windows allowed buildings to be both weatherproof and filled with daylight, transforming domestic life. People rearranged their furniture to take advantage of the new natural light. Rooms became brighter, warmer, and more inviting. The cost of glass windows kept them a luxury for centuries. In England, glass was so valuable that windows were sometimes listed separately from the buildings that held them. When wealthy families moved, they sometimes took their windows with them, removing the glass panes and reinstalling them in their new home. In 1696, the English government imposed a tax based on the number of windows in a building. The immediate result was predictable. Homeowners bricked up their windows to reduce what they owed. The phrase daylight robbery may have originated as a reference to this tax, which quite literally robbed people of daylight. Bricked up window spaces from this era are still visible in old buildings across England today. The tax remained in effect for 155 years, during which doctors increasingly documented the health consequences of living without adequate light. Diseases associated with dark, poorly ventilated conditions were rampant in working-class neighborhoods. The tax was finally abolished in 1851, the same year the Crystal Palace showed the world what glass could do when it was set free. The development of a new kind of flat glass in the 18th and 19th centuries removed another barrier. This plate glass was made by pouring molten glass onto a flat surface, letting it cool, and then grinding and polishing both sides until they were perfectly smooth and clear. It was expensive, but it produced sheets far larger and more transparent than anything before. French glassmakers pioneered this technique initially to supply the enormous mirrors needed for Versailles. By the 19th century, the same glass was being used for shop windows, allowing merchants to display their goods to people walking past and creating the entirely new activity of window shopping. The Crystal Palace proved that glass could be a structural material, not merely something that filled holes in walls. Its influence was immediate and lasting. Exhibition halls, railway stations, and department stores across Europe adopted glass and iron construction in the decades that followed. Architecture, for thousands of years a discipline of stone and enclosure, was being remade as a discipline of transparency and light, and glass was the material that made the transformation possible. In the winter of 1761, a newly completed building at Kew Gardens in southwest London received rows of citrus trees, their dark green leaves glistening, wheeled inside to shelter from the English frost. The building, an elegant stone structure with tall glass windows, represented the finest horticultural architecture of its day. But within decades, it would be recognized as a failure. The building was too dark for the citrus trees, which needed more light than its relatively small windows could provide. The plants eventually had to be moved out entirely. The story of this failure contains an essential lesson about glass and architecture. It was not enough to build a room with windows. To truly conquer climate, to create a space where tropical plants could thrive in a cold northern country, you had to build a room that was almost entirely made of glass. The greenhouse emerged from a specific historical need. Beginning in the 1500s, European explorers were bringing plants from Africa, Asia, and the Americas back to Europe in ever-increasing numbers. Botanists, aristocrats, and royal courts wanted to grow these exotic specimens, but tropical plants could not survive northern European winters. The solution was a structure that used glass to trap the warmth of sunlight and create an artificial climate. The earliest greenhouses, dating to the late 16th century, were modest affairs, essentially sheltered garden walls with glass panels that could be taken off in summer. The orangery was the most prestigious form of early greenhouse, designed primarily to protect citrus trees, which had become symbols of wealth and refined taste across the continent. The orangery at the Palace of Versailles, built in the 1680s, was an enormous structure capable of housing over 1,000 orange trees in decorated pots. It stretched 150 meters along its south-facing wall, with arched windows to catch as much winter sun as possible. But even this grand building was more of a storage room than a growing environment, designed to keep the trees alive through winter rather than to simulate the tropics year-round. The true revolution in greenhouse design came in the early 19th century when engineers discovered that iron frames could support vast spans of glass without the need for massive stone walls. The Palm House at Kew Gardens, built between 1844 and 1848, represented the height of Victorian greenhouse engineering. It was the first large-scale use of wrought iron in a building, using techniques borrowed from shipbuilding to create a pillarless interior flooded with light. The palm house could maintain tropical temperatures all year, allowing palms and other equatorial plants to grow as if they were in their native lands. It remains today one of the most important surviving Victorian structures. An even larger greenhouse at Kew, completed later in the century, had twice the floor area. Together, these two buildings showed that glass could do more than protect plants from cold. It could create entirely artificial worlds, complete ecosystems contained within walls of glass, where plants from every corner of the earth could grow side by side. The greenhouse was not merely a horticultural curiosity, though. It was an instrument of empire. The great botanical gardens of the 19th century, Kew above all, served as laboratories for moving economically valuable plants across the globe. Rubber trees from the Amazon were grown under glass at Kew before being shipped to Southeast Asia, where they founded the plantation industry that would supply the world's rubber. Trees that produce quinine, the medicine that fights malaria, were cultivated under glass before being transplanted to India. Tea plants were studied at Kew before being sent to new growing regions. The greenhouse was the quiet tool through which colonial powers redistributed the world's botanical wealth to wherever it served their interests. And here is an irony worth pausing on. The glass greenhouse also accidentally gave its name to the most important environmental concept of our time. In the 1820s, a French mathematician calculated that the Earth should be significantly colder than it actually is if it were warmed only by incoming sunlight. He compared the Earth and its atmosphere to a box with a glass cover. Just as glass in a greenhouse allows sunlight to enter but traps the resulting warmth inside, he proposed that the atmosphere performs a similar function, letting the sun's energy reach the ground while preventing the resulting heat from escaping back into space. He never used the phrase greenhouse effect, but his comparison between glass and the atmosphere gave the concept the name by which we know it today. The material that allowed humans to create artificial climates inside buildings provided the metaphor for understanding the much larger process by which human activity is changing the climate of the entire planet. The greenhouse, built to shelter delicate plants from the cold, lent its name to the phenomenon that is now making parts of the Earth too warm for many species to survive. Today, greenhouses remain essential to feeding the world. The Netherlands, despite its cold, grey climate, is one of the largest food exporters on Earth, a feat made possible by vast complexes of computer-controlled glass greenhouses covering thousands of acres of Dutch countryside. 5,000 years after glass was first created by accident, it remains indispensable for growing the food we eat. In the year 1903, in a factory in Toledo, Ohio, a machine built by a self-taught inventor named Michael Owens began producing glass bottles at a rate that would have seemed miraculous to every previous generation of glassmakers. The machine could make 240 bottles per minute, a feat that a skilled glassblower, working at full speed, could not match in an entire day. A single machine replaced the labor of dozens of men and boys, cut production costs by 80%, and transformed the glass bottle from a relatively expensive container into one of the cheapest packaging materials on Earth. A national committee reviewing the impact of this machine concluded that it had done more to eliminate child labor from the glass industry than all the laws passed by all the states combined. Owens was born in 1859 in West Virginia and began working in a glass factory at the age of 10. He spent his childhood carrying red-hot bottles from the blowing station to the cooling oven, one of the most dangerous jobs in the factory. He received no formal education beyond what the factory floor could teach him, but he possessed an intuitive understanding of glass and machinery. In 1898, he conceived the crucial idea that made automatic bottle production possible. Instead of gathering molten glass on the end of a blowpipe, as glassblowers had done for 2,000 years, the machine would use suction to draw glass upward from a pool of molten material, forming and blowing the bottle entirely by mechanical means. The Owens machine was the high point of a longer process of industrialization that had been transforming the glass industry throughout the 19th century. That transformation is a story of gradual mechanization, changing tax policies, and the slow opening up of a material that had been, for most of its 5,000-year history, accessible only to the wealthy. The first major step toward making glass available to everyone came not from technology but from taxation. In Britain, the government had imposed a tax on glass by weight since the late 1600s. This tax punished manufacturers who made thick, durable glass and encouraged the production of thin, fragile items. It made glass artificially expensive and stifled innovation. When the tax was finally removed in 1845 and the window tax followed 6 years later, the effect was immediate and dramatic. Production increased, prices fell, and glass became available to a far wider portion of the population. The development of pressed glass in America during the 1820s represented another revolution in affordability. A manufacturer on Cape Cod in Massachusetts was among the first to experiment with pressing molten glass into molds using a mechanical lever. Instead of blowing glass into shape, which required years of training, pressed glass was formed by pushing a lump of hot glass into an iron mold with a plunger. The process was fast, consistent, and required far less skill than traditional methods. The factory soon was producing enormous quantities of affordable tableware, lamps, candlesticks, and decorative objects in a wide range of colors and patterns. For the first time, working families could own glass tableware that was attractive, functional, and surprisingly durable. Pressed glass had its limitations. The surface bore the marks of the mold, and its clarity was less than that of blown glass. Mold makers addressed this by carving tiny patterns into the molds that disguised imperfections. Imagine running your fingers across the surface of a pressed glass dish and feeling the delicate stippled texture, little dots and circles that both hide the flaws and create their own decorative charm. But what pressed glass lacked in refinement, it more than made up for in affordability. For a few pennies, a family could own a sugar bowl or a salt dish that caught the light and brought a small touch of elegance to an otherwise plain table. The mechanization of flat glass production followed a similar path. The ancient broadsheet method was refined so that glass blowers could produce enormous cylinders, sometimes several meters long, which were then cut open and flattened into sheets of window glass. A further mechanized process, developed in the early 1900s, could produce cylinders more than 12 meters long. These were then flattened into glass sheets far more uniform than anything the old spinning method could achieve. The Industrial Revolution also expanded what glass could look like. New types of colored glass, opalescent glass, and glass with novel surface effects gave designers and manufacturers an ever wider palette to work with. Parlors across America and Europe filled with pressed glass dishes, colored vases, etched tumblers, and glass lampshades, all produced in quantities and at prices that would have astonished the masters of Murano. But the industrialization of glass came at a terrible human cost, particularly for the children who made up a significant portion of the glass industry's workforce. Behind the gleaming products that filled homes and shops lay a darker story of labor, danger, and exploitation, a story that deserves its own telling. In 1911, a photographer named Lewis Hine walked into a glass factory in Virginia and began taking pictures. What he saw and documented would shock the American conscience. Boys as young as 10 crouched beside blazing furnaces, their small hands opening and closing heavy iron molds that held molten glass at temperatures beyond 1,000 degrees. Other children, called carrying-in boys, walked back and forth across the factory floor for hours, transporting red-hot glass from the blowing station to the cooling oven, covering miles in a single shift. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with glass dust, and the risk of burns, cuts, and exhaustion was constant. Hine documented these conditions in over 150 photographs of children working in glass factories across 8 states. His images, published by a national committee fighting child labor, became some of the most powerful arguments in the campaign to end the exploitation of children in American industry. The children in his photographs had specific roles in the factory. Some crouched beside the glass blower, opening and closing the mold. Others stood next to the press, catching freshly formed cups as they were released. Still others carried finished pieces to the cooling oven. Each of these jobs was dangerous, exhausting, and poorly paid. The children worked 12-hour shifts, often through the night, in temperatures that could reach 50 degrees near the furnaces. Burns were a daily occurrence, and the long-term effects of heat, dust, and fatigue took a devastating toll on their health. But child labor was only the most visible part of the human cost of glassmaking. Adult glassworkers faced their own hazards, many of them fatal. Glassblowers suffered from a distinctive eye condition caused by years of exposure to the intense heat radiating from molten glass. The radiation gradually damaged the lens of the eye, producing a type of clouding that could lead to blindness. This condition was so common among glassworkers that it became one of the first diseases recognized as directly caused by a specific occupation, and it played a role in the development of workplace health as a field of study. The lungs of glassworkers were equally at risk. Breathing in the fine dust created during the mixing and handling of raw glass materials caused a slow, progressive disease in which tiny particles lodge in the lung tissue and trigger a chain of damage that leads to shortness of breath, chronic coughing, and eventually the inability to breathe. The disease developed over years or decades, and by the time symptoms became severe, the damage could not be undone. The mirror makers of Venice, as we touched on earlier, endured the additional horror of mercury poisoning. But mercury was not the only dangerous substance that glass workers handled. The lead used in fine crystal and optical instruments was toxic to anyone who touched it regularly, causing pain, stiffness, memory loss, and eventually organ failure. The painters who decorated glass with lead-based colors were similarly at risk. The social standing of glassworkers varied enormously across time and place. In Venice, the master glassblowers of Murano were treated as near royalty, their skills so valued that they were forbidden to leave but rewarded with wealth and privilege. In contrast, the glassworkers of the Industrial Revolution, particularly in America and England, were among the most exploited laborers in the manufacturing economy. The contrast could hardly be sharper. In one era and place, glassmakers were celebrated as artists and guarded as national treasures, while in another, they were expendable workers whose health was sacrificed to the demands of mass production. The glass industry was among the earliest to develop organized labor movements. A glassworkers' union founded in the United States in 1878 was one of the oldest craft unions in the country. Workers had considerable bargaining power as long as their skills were essential, since training a skilled glassblower could take years. But the introduction of automatic machines fundamentally changed the balance. When a single machine could replace dozens of skilled workers, the leverage that came from irreplaceable craftsmanship evaporated. Mechanization, while it eliminated the worst forms of child labor, also destroyed the economic position of adult skilled workers, replacing well-paid craftsmen with lower-paid machine operators. The physical environment of a glass factory was a world of extremes. The temperature near the furnace could be beyond imagining, while the rest of the building might be freezing in winter. Workers moved constantly between heat and cold, a cycle that punished the body and contributed to illness. The noise was tremendous, the glare blinding, and the pace of work relentless, dictated by the fact that molten glass cools and becomes unworkable within seconds. The story of glass and labor is a story about the tension between beauty and suffering, between the luminous products that glass creates and the difficult conditions under which they have often been made. Every window, every bottle, every lens represents not only a triumph of skill, but also a debt to the generations of workers whose labor made it possible. The modern glass industry has eliminated many of the worst abuses, but in some parts of the world, glass is still made by hand in conditions that the photographer Louis Hine would have recognized, a reminder that the human cost of glass is not entirely a thing of the past. In September of 1608, a ship arrived at the struggling English settlement of Jamestown, Virginia, carrying among its passengers 3 German glassmakers who had been recruited to establish what would become America's first industrial enterprise. The colonial company that financed the settlement hoped that glass production would provide the desperately needed product that could justify the enormous cost of maintaining a colony in the wilderness. The logic was reasonable enough. Virginia had plentiful sand, limitless wood for fuel, and glass was in short supply in London. The three craftsmen labored for 2 months inside the walls of the fort and produced what the records describe as a trial of glass, probably just an ingot or a few rough vessels sent back to England on a returning ship to prove that the colony's resources could support production. It was a promising beginning that ended in disaster. The terrible winter that followed reduced Jamestown's population from roughly 500 settlers to just 60 starving survivors. Glass production understandably ceased. A second attempt was made 13 years later when Italian glassmakers were brought to the colony, but this effort also failed, likely defeated by the same combination of disease, conflict, and the overwhelming challenges of staying alive. The site of that original workshop, rebuilt and preserved today, stands as a monument to the ambition and fragility of America's first industry. The glass industry in colonial America struggled for over a century after Jamestown. Skilled glassmakers were scarce, the local sand was often unsuitable, and the colonial authorities discouraged manufacturing in favor of exporting raw materials to England. The first commercially successful glass factory was established by a German immigrant in southern New Jersey in 1739. He brought experienced workers from Europe and produced window glass and bottles that found a ready market among the growing colonial population. His factory operated for nearly 4 decades before the American Revolution forced it to close. Another ambitious German immigrant established a glassworks in Pennsylvania in the 1760s, producing tableware of exceptional quality, including colored and painted glass that rivaled European imports. His ambitions, however, outran his finances, and he was eventually imprisoned for debt. His glass, now highly prized by collectors, represents the first attempt to produce fine art glass in America rather than merely practical bottles and window panes. The pressed glass revolution of the 1820s transformed American glass from a minor colonial industry into a major manufacturing force. A company on Cape Cod pioneered the use of mechanical presses to form glass into decorative patterns, creating tableware affordable enough for ordinary homes. The factory produced an enormous range of items in vivid colors: deep blue, emerald green, bright yellow, and purple, bringing decorative glass into American households that had never before been able to afford it. The American Brilliant Cut Glass period, spanning roughly from 1876 to 1917, represented the peak of American glass craftsmanship. Inspired by the crystal-cutting traditions of Bohemia and Ireland, American companies produced deeply cut lead crystal of extraordinary sparkle. Thick, heavy blanks of crystal were cut on revolving wheels to create patterns that split light into tiny rainbows. If you have ever held a piece of heavy cut crystal up to a window and watched the room fill with small points of colored light dancing across the walls and ceiling, you have experienced the same magic that made brilliant cut glass so prized. This was luxury glass, displayed at international exhibitions, given as wedding gifts among the wealthy, and shipped to customers around the world. The period ended with the onset of the First World War, which disrupted the supply of skilled European cutters and shifted taste towards simpler, more modern designs. But the most lasting contribution of American glass art came from Louis Comfort Tiffany, the son of the founder of the famous jewelry firm. Tiffany was a painter and designer who became captivated by the possibilities of colored glass. In his studio in New York, he developed a type of glass with shimmering, color-shifting surfaces unlike anything the glass world had ever seen. He trademarked the name in 1894 and began producing blown glass vessels that collectors would treasure for generations. Tiffany's greatest achievements were his stained glass windows and lamps. Using a technique that replaced the traditional lead strips of medieval glass with thin copper foil wrapped around each piece and soldered together, he achieved a level of detail and subtlety impossible with older methods. His lamps, assembled from hundreds or thousands of individual pieces of colored glass, depicted flowers, dragonflies, peacocks, and natural landscapes in glass of breathtaking beauty. Many of the designs were created by a talented woman named Clara Driscoll and her team of women designers. Tiffany lamps became icons of American decorative art, inspiring generations of artists and craftsmen who followed. The American glass tradition, from the crude trial glass of Jamestown to the luminous masterpieces of Tiffany, traces a path from colonial desperation to artistic triumph, a story that mirrors the larger American narrative of immigrant skill, industrial ambition, and creative innovation. In the early 17th century, at the court of the Holy Roman Emperor in Prague, a gem cutter named Caspar Lehmann had an idea that would transform the European glass industry. Lehmann, who had spent years cutting and engraving precious stones using rotating copper wheels, applied the same technique to glass. He found that glass could be cut, shaped, and engraved with extraordinary precision, and that the resulting surfaces caught and scattered light with a brilliance that rivaled diamonds. He received an imperial patent for his technique, and his innovation launched a tradition that would make the lands of Bohemia, in what is now the Czech Republic, the glass capital of Europe for the next 3 centuries. Bohemia's rise as a glass-making power was rooted in geography. The mountains and forests of northern Bohemia provided abundant fuel in the form of timber and the ash it produced, while the local geology yielded high-quality sand. Glass-making in the region dates back to roughly 1250, and by the 1500s over 30 workshops were active. But it was the development of a distinctive Bohemian glass recipe that set Czech glass apart from all competitors. While Venetian glass used a coastal plant ash that made it light and thin, suited to delicate blown forms, Bohemian glassmakers used wood ash, which produced glass that was harder, denser, and more brilliant. This glass could be cut and polished in ways that were simply impossible with Venetian glass, and it sparkled with an inner fire that caught light from every angle. The Bohemian crystal industry reached its first great flowering during the Baroque period. The thick, heavy glass lent itself perfectly to deep cutting, and Czech engravers developed elaborate designs, geometric patterns, hunting scenes, coats of arms and portraits that turned drinking goblets and covered cups into miniature works of sculptural art. The skill required was remarkable. The engraver had to work in reverse, pressing the glass against a spinning copper wheel while judging depth and detail by feel as much as by sight. The best Bohemian engravers were among the most sought-after artisans in all of Europe. The introduction of the glass chandelier marked another chapter in Bohemia's rise. The first chandelier made entirely of Bohemian crystal is traditionally dated to the early 18th century. Before this, chandeliers had been made of metal, sometimes adorned with glass pendants. The innovation was to construct the entire fixture from cut and polished crystal, the arms, the candle holders, the decorative elements, and the dangling pendants. The result was an object of extraordinary beauty. When lit by candlelight, a Bohemian crystal chandelier transformed an entire room into a theater of refracted light, with thousands of individual glass surfaces splitting the flames into tiny rainbows. Can you imagine that scene for a moment? A great hall, lit only by candles, and above, a chandelier made entirely of glass, every surface catching and scattering the warm flickering light into 1,000 points of color. Bohemian crystal chandeliers became essential furnishings for every important palace in Europe. The demand created an entire export industry, with glass merchants traveling across the continent and eventually to the Americas, Asia, and the Middle East. By the 1700s, Bohemian crystal had displaced Venetian glass as the prestige glass of the European elite. The tradition of colored glass also flourished in Bohemia. Czech glassmakers developed a spectacular range, including a deep red glass produced by adding a tiny amount of gold to the molten mixture. This gold ruby glass became one of the most prized luxury glasses in the world. Later innovators developed methods of staining glass with other metallic compounds to produce brilliant yellow and red overlays, adding further depth to the Bohemian palette. The arrival of new artistic movements at the end of the 19th century brought fresh energy to Bohemian glass. Czech factories produced glass with shimmering iridescent surfaces that rivaled the work being done across the Atlantic. Another company, founded in the middle of the century, transitioned from clear engraved glass to richly colored vessels decorated with plant motifs and forest scenes, creating a distinctly Bohemian style that was collected by royalty and displayed at international exhibitions. The 20th century brought upheaval that reshaped the Czech glass world. 2 world wars, political convulsions, and decades of state control all transformed the industry. Yet the tradition survived, partly because even the state authorities recognized glass as a valuable export and supported the glass schools and factories. Czech artists working within the constraints of a controlled economy produced work of extraordinary creativity, blending traditional cutting and engraving with modern sculptural approaches. Today, Czech crystal remains a byword for quality and craftsmanship. The glass schools of the Czech Republic continue to train new generations in techniques refined over more than 7 centuries. The Bohemian glass tradition, born in the forests of Northern Europe and polished at the court of an emperor, endures as one of the longest continuous craft traditions in the world. One evening in 1952, a man named Alistair Pilkington was washing dishes at his home in the north of England when he noticed something simple but suggestive. A film of grease floated perfectly flat on the surface of the washing up water. The observation sparked an idea that would take 7 years, cost millions of pounds, and very nearly bankrupt one of Britain's oldest glass companies, but which would ultimately prove to be the most important invention in the entire 5,000-year history of glass. What if, Pilkington wondered, you could pour molten glass onto a bath of molten metal and let it float there, spreading out under its own weight to form a perfectly flat, perfectly smooth ribbon of glass? The idea was elegant in its simplicity, but extraordinarily difficult to put into practice. The metal had to have a melting point low enough to stay liquid at the temperatures needed for working glass. It had to be denser than glass so that the glass would float on top. And it had to be compatible with glass, neither reacting with it nor ruining it. Tin turned out to be the only metal that met all these requirements. Working with a colleague, Pilkington spent the next 7 years at the family glass factory developing and perfecting the process. The challenges were immense. The molten glass, poured continuously from a furnace at roughly 1100 degrees onto a bath of molten tin, had to be kept in a carefully controlled atmosphere to prevent the tin from reacting with the air. The speed of the glass ribbon had to be precisely regulated too fast, and the glass would be too thin and wavy, too slow, and it would cool unevenly. The temperature along the entire length of the tin bath had to be managed so that the glass entered as a thick liquid and left as a smooth solid, requiring no grinding or polishing whatsoever. For years, the process refused to work properly. The glass came out cloudy, warped, or marked by the tin. The company's directors debated whether to abandon the project. Pilkington later estimated that the firm spent roughly £7 million, an enormous sum at the time, before the process began producing glass of acceptable quality. The patience of the family who owned the company was essential. Few modern businesses, answerable to short-term profit expectations, would have tolerated 7 years of expensive failure. The breakthrough came gradually, and in January of 1959, Pilkington announced the float glass process to the world. The response was immediate astonishment. Full-scale profitable production was achieved the following year, and within a decade the process had been licensed to glass manufacturers across the globe. By the end of the 20th century, it had almost entirely replaced every previous method of making flat glass. Today, roughly 90% of the world's flat glass is made by the float method. The significance of float glass lies not just in its quality, but in its economics. Before this invention, producing perfectly flat, optically clear glass required either grinding and polishing plate glass, which was slow and costly, or using older methods that produced glass that was inherently wavy and distorted. Float glass eliminated all these compromises. The ribbon of glass that comes out of a float line is perfectly flat on both surfaces, optically clear and uniform in thickness, needing no further work. And it is produced continuously, at speeds of up to 25 meters per minute, in ribbons more than 3 meters wide. A single factory can produce 1 million square meters of glass in a week. This combination of quality and affordability made possible virtually every modern application of flat glass. The glass walls of modern office towers, which require enormous sheets of perfectly clear glass, would be impossibly expensive without the float process. The windshields of modern cars, which must be optically perfect so as not to distort the driver's view, depend on it. The screens of televisions, computer monitors, and the phones we carry in our pockets all use glass that traces its origin to this process. Even the solar panels being deployed by the millions to generate clean energy use float glass as their protective cover. Pilkington was knighted by the Queen in 1970 for his contribution, and he lived to see his invention transform the built environment of the entire world. He died in 1995. The float glass process is one of those rare innovations so superior to everything that came before it that it made all previous methods obsolete within a single generation. In the 5,000-year history of glass, from the first accidental discovery in a Mesopotamian kiln to the smart glass of the 21st century, the float process stands as perhaps the single most consequential invention, the breakthrough that made glass truly universal. In 1921, a young German architect named Ludwig Mies van der Rohe submitted a competition entry for a tower in Berlin that astonished and bewildered his contemporaries. The design showed a building made almost entirely of glass, its facets reflecting the sky and the surrounding city like a vast angular prism. The tower was never built, but the drawings became among the most influential architectural images of the 20th century. Glass, Mies believed, was the truest expression of modern architecture, a material that concealed nothing, that made structure visible and filled interior spaces with light. It would take nearly 4 decades for his vision to be fully realized. The Seagram Building, completed in 1958 on Park Avenue in New York City, was Mies van der Rohe's masterpiece and the building that defined the modern glass tower. Rising 38 stories above a granite plaza, it was the first skyscraper in New York to use full-height glass windows from ground to roof. The facade was detailed with vertical bronze elements that gave the building a warm amber tone. At $41 million, it was the most expensive skyscraper in the world at the time, a cost that reflected the uncompromising quality of its design. Mies personally supervised the placement of window blinds so that they could only be set in 3 positions, fully open, halfway, or closed, to maintain the building's appearance from the outside. The Seagram Building set a new standard for what a modern office building should look like. Its influence was immediate and profound. Within a decade, glass curtain wall towers were rising in every major city in the world. The glass box became the universal form of corporate architecture, a style that expressed modernity, transparency, and efficiency. But the glass skyscraper was not without its problems. The very transparency that made glass towers visually striking also made them difficult to keep comfortable. Glass lets heat pass through far more readily than stone or brick, meaning that glass buildings need enormous amounts of energy to heat in winter and cool in summer. Air conditioning, itself a relatively new technology at the time, became essential to making these buildings livable. The energy consumed by climate control systems in glass-clad buildings contributed significantly to urban energy use and pollution. By the late 20th century, critics were pointing to the glass skyscraper as an example of beauty outrunning responsibility. The engineering of glass for tall buildings advanced rapidly in response. Invisible metallic coatings applied to the glass surface dramatically reduced heat transfer while maintaining transparency. Sealed units of 2 or more panes with gas-filled spaces between them improved insulation. Glass bonded with a layer of plastic provided both safety and sound dampening. And glass that had been specially heated and then rapidly cooled was 4 to 5 times stronger than ordinary glass. These innovations transformed the glass wall from a simple weather barrier into a sophisticated system for managing light, heat, and sound. The tallest glass-clad buildings pushed engineering to its limits. The tower in Dubai that stands over 800 meters tall is covered in more than 26,000 glass panels that must withstand not only wind and extreme heat, but also the fierce desert sun. At the other extreme, glass towers in cities like Moscow and Chicago must endure temperature swings of more than 60 degrees between summer and winter, placing enormous stress on every seal and joint. The spread of glass buildings has had one devastating and largely unintended consequence: the killing of birds. Glass is invisible to birds, which see the sky or trees reflected in windows and fly straight into them. In the United States alone, estimates suggest that over 1 billion birds die each year in collisions with glass. A single incident at a convention center in Chicago killed at least 1,000 birds in one day. The problem was first taken seriously in the 1970s, and solutions have been slow to develop. Glass printed with faint patterns visible to birds but barely noticeable to humans has proven effective where it has been used. After one building installed bird-friendly treatments, collision deaths fell by roughly 95%. Several cities have now passed or proposed laws requiring bird-safe glass in new construction. The glass skyscraper, born from a young architect's dream in 1920s Berlin, has become the defining form of the modern city. For better and for worse, glass towers have remade urban landscapes on every continent, creating cities of light and transparency that Mies van der Rohe could only have imagined. The challenge now is to make these buildings not just beautiful, but also responsible, efficient in their use of energy, and safe for the birds and other creatures that share our cities. And while glass was reshaping the skylines above us, another innovation was threading glass beneath our feet and across our ocean floors, carrying light at speeds that would have seemed beyond imagining. In 1966, a young engineer named Charles Cow sat in a laboratory in England and made a prediction that most of his colleagues thought was absurd. In a paper he co-wrote with a colleague, Cow argued that glass fibers, strands of extremely pure glass thinner than a human hair, could carry information encoded as pulses of light over distances of many miles. At the time, the best glass fibers available lost so much light over even short distances that they were useless for communication. A signal entering one end of a fiber came out the other end so weakened that it could barely be detected. The problem, Cow argued, was not that glass could not carry light. The problem was that the glass being used was not pure enough. If glass could be made clean enough, free of the tiny impurities that scattered and absorbed the light, then glass fibers could carry information at rates that would make copper wire obsolete. His prediction was met with deep skepticism. The level of purity he described would require a 1,000-fold improvement over the best fibers available. Many physicists thought the target was simply impossible, but Cow's analysis was careful. His understanding of the science was sound, and his prediction turned out to be conservative. Within 4 years, a team at a glass company in upstate New York had produced a fiber that met Cow's target. The key was a glass of extraordinary purity, with tiny amounts of other elements added to create a core that bent light inward, trapping it inside the fiber. Light entering the core bounced along its length, and the purity of the glass ensured that very little was lost along the way. This fiber had a capacity 65,000 times greater than copper wire. It was lighter, thinner, and immune to the electrical interference that plagued copper systems. And unlike copper, which was expensive and increasingly scarce, the raw material for glass fiber, the most common mineral compound on the surface of the Earth, was effectively unlimited. Glass, the oldest manufactured material in human history, was about to become the backbone of the digital age. The transition from laboratory breakthrough to global network took roughly 2 decades. Through the 1970s and 80s, telecommunications companies laid increasingly ambitious networks of fiber optic cable. In 1977, the first commercial fiber optic telephone system was installed in Chicago, and by the early 80s, fiber was being woven into telephone networks across the developed world. The real transformation came with cables laid across the ocean floor. In 1988, the first transatlantic fiber optic link connected the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, carrying 40,000 simultaneous telephone calls through strands of glass on the bottom of the Atlantic. Today, the world is wrapped in a web of undersea fiber optic cables that carry roughly 99% of all data that crosses between continents. Hundreds of cable systems cross every ocean, running along the seafloor at depths of up to 8,000 meters. The total length of these undersea glass threads exceeds 1.3 million miles, enough to circle the Earth more than 30 times. Every email you send, every video you watch, every call you make that crosses an ocean travels as pulses of light through glass strands thinner than a hair. The internet, that defining structure of our age, runs on glass. The way it works is elegant in its simplicity. A tiny laser at one end generates pulses of light, each pulse representing a piece of digital information. The light travels through the glass core of the fiber, bouncing off the boundary between the core and its outer layer, trapped inside by a principle of physics first described mathematically in the early 1600s. Boosters placed at intervals along the cable strengthen the signal. At the receiving end, a detector converts the light back into electrical signals. The whole process happens at the speed of light. The capacity of modern systems would astonish even Cao himself. Techniques that send multiple signals through the same fiber at different colors of light allow a single pair of fibers to carry data at speeds beyond imagination. Researchers have demonstrated experimental systems capable of carrying enough data to stream 100 million high-definition videos at the same time. Charles Cao was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2009. By then, he was suffering from a disease that affected his memory, and he was unable to deliver the traditional lecture himself. His wife accepted the prize on his behalf and read his words to the assembled audience. It was a poignant moment. The man whose vision had connected the world could no longer fully understand the world he had helped create. Cao died in 2018, but his legacy, encoded in light and carried through glass, continues to expand at the speed of information itself. On January 9th, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced the iPhone, a device that would change the way billions of people interact with information, with each other, and with glass. The first prototype had a plastic screen, and Jobs was reportedly pleased with it until he started carrying one in his pocket alongside his keys. Within a day, the plastic was covered in scratches. Jobs, whose attention to detail was legendary, was furious. He called the head of a glass company in upstate New York and told him that Apple needed a thin, tough, scratch-proof glass for the iPhone screen. The reply was unexpected. The company had developed exactly such a glass in the 1960s, but had never found a major use for it. The glass had been sitting on a shelf for more than 40 years, waiting for a problem worthy of its abilities. The glass in question was the product of a research project launched in 1960. A scientist at the company had developed a way to strengthen glass through a chemical bath. The finished glass was dipped into a hot bath of molten salt, and during the soaking, smaller particles in the glass surface were gradually replaced by larger ones from the salt. Because the replacements were physically bigger than the ones they pushed out, they squeezed into the glass and created a layer of tremendous compression on the surface. This compressed layer made the glass extraordinarily resistant to scratching and impact, because any crack that started on the surface had to first overcome that crushing force before it could spread deeper. The company had marketed this strengthened glass in the 1960s and early 70s for car windshields and aviation windows, but without a mass consumer market, production stayed small. When Jobs called in late 2006, the company recognized that the smartphone could be the application this glass had been waiting for. They pulled the old research off the shelf, assembled a team, and began adapting the glass for the specific demands of a phone screen. It had to be extremely thin, optically clear, sensitive to touch, and tough enough to survive daily life in a pocket or bag. The collaboration moved at extraordinary speed. The glass was reformulated, the chemical bath was optimized, and new manufacturing methods were developed. The result, officially branded with its famous name in 2008, was incorporated into smartphones, tablets, and laptop computers by manufacturers around the world almost immediately. By 2024, this glass had been used in more than 8 billion devices worldwide, making it one of the most widely used specialty materials in history. The success transformed the glass company from a respected but quiet industrial firm into a technology powerhouse. Before the smartphone era, its most famous consumer product was heat-resistant bakeware. After the partnership with Apple, the company was at the center of a global revolution, supplying the critical surface between human fingers and digital information. The glass has continued to improve through multiple generations. Each new version has been thinner, stronger, and more scratch-resistant than its predecessor. Recent versions can survive drops from heights of 2 meters onto hard surfaces. The company has also developed versions with germ-fighting properties, versions transparent to the light that cameras need, and glass thin enough to bend without breaking, enabling the new generation of folding phones. The rise of smartphone glass has created an entirely new relationship between humans and this ancient material. The average phone user touches their screen thousands of times per day, making this one of the most frequently touched materials on Earth. This physical intimacy is unprecedented in the 5,000-year history of glass. For most of that time, glass was something to look at or look through, appreciated at a distance. The smartphone has made glass something to be touched, swiped, tapped, and pressed, transforming it from a visual medium into something deeply tactile. The story of this glass also shows a pattern that appears again and again in the history of the material: the long gap between invention and application. The chemical strengthening process was developed in 1960, but found its transformative use only in 2007, 47 years later. Float glass was conceived in 1952, but did not become commercially viable for nearly a decade. Optical fiber was theorized in 1966, but did not become the backbone of global communication until the 1990s. Glass innovations, it seems, often require decades of patient development before the world is ready for them. The decision to keep the old research rather than throw it away was an act of institutional memory that paid off beyond anything its inventors could have dreamed. Today, the smartphone screen has become so woven into daily life that it is easy to forget what a remarkable object it is. A sheet of glass less than a millimeter thick, strengthened at the molecular level, optically perfect, responsive to the lightest touch, and tough enough to survive years of daily use, connecting its owner to the sum of human knowledge. It is, in a very real sense, the most sophisticated piece of glass ever made, the culmination of 5,000 years of craft and science, compressed into a surface that fits in the palm of a hand. On a warm day in the spring of 1962, in a converted workshop at a museum in Toledo, Ohio, a ceramics professor named Harvey Littleton and a glass scientist named Dominic Labino lit a small furnace and began to blow glass. The workshop was modest in scale and experimental in spirit, but it would prove to be one of the most important events in the modern history of glass. Littleton believed passionately that glass could be a medium for individual artistic expression, not merely a material for factory production. The problem was that glass blowing had always required the infrastructure of a factory, massive furnaces, specialized equipment, teams of workers, and enormous amounts of fuel. Littleton wanted to free glass from the factory and bring it into the artist's studio. Labino solved the key practical problems. He designed a compact, portable furnace and provided a glass that melted at temperatures achievable in a small setup. During the 2 workshops held that spring and summer, the participants demonstrated that an individual artist could melt, gather, and blow glass without the resources of an entire factory. The pieces produced were rough and unrefined, but the principle was established. Glass could be a studio art medium, personal and expressive, the way painting or sculpture had always been. The impact was immediate. Littleton returned to his university in Wisconsin, where he set up the first university glass program in the country. His students, including a young man from the Pacific Northwest named Dale Chihuly, would carry this new movement forward with creative energy that transformed the art world's relationship with glass. Within a decade, glass programs had been established at schools across the United States and eventually around the world. Chihuly became the most famous and most discussed figure to emerge from this movement. After studying with Littleton, he traveled to Venice in 1968 to work at a famous glass factory on Murano, bringing ancient Italian techniques back to America and fusing them with the experimental spirit of the American art scene. His earliest works were inspired by the patterns and shapes of Native American baskets, translating fiber forms into the transparency and color of glass. Series after series followed, each pushing the scale and ambition of glass art further than anyone had previously attempted. In 1976, Chihuly lost the sight in one eye in a car accident, and 3 years later he injured his shoulder so severely that he could no longer hold a blowpipe. Rather than ending his career, these injuries transformed it. He became a director and designer, leading teams of skilled assistants who executed his visions under his guidance. This approach, modeled in some ways on the Renaissance workshop, allowed him to work at a monumental scale. His installations eventually filled entire gardens, museum galleries, and public spaces, bringing glass art to audiences who would never have stepped inside a craft gallery. A project in 1996 suspended glass chandeliers over the canals of Venice, creating a conversation between the new American glass movement and the ancient traditions of Murano. His permanent installations at hotels, museums, and a dedicated garden in Seattle have drawn millions of visitors. Chihuly's success also sparked a debate that continues to this day. Is glass art really art, or is it merely craft? The distinction has deep roots in Western culture, and it has haunted glass artists for decades. Major art galleries and museums were slow to accept glass as a serious medium, viewing it as decorative rather than meaningful, beautiful rather than thought-provoking. Glass artists responded by pushing their work in increasingly conceptual and sculptural directions, making pieces that addressed social, political, and environmental themes alongside purely visual ones. Beyond this single famous figure, the international glass art community has produced a remarkable diversity of work. Czech artists, building on their country's centuries of glass tradition, have created sculptural and architectural glass that bridges the gap between craft and fine art. Japanese glass artists have brought a sensitivity to imperfection and the beauty of the transient to a material traditionally associated with permanence. Australian artists have drawn on the landscapes and light of their continent. African bead artists have revived and reinvented ancient traditions, connecting contemporary practice to centuries of craft heritage. The studio glass movement, now more than 60 years old, has fundamentally changed what glass means in the world of art and culture. Before 1962, glass was understood mainly as a functional material. After the movement, it became a medium of expression as rich and varied as paint, clay, or bronze. Littleton, who died in 2013 at the age of 91, lived to see his dream become a global reality, with thousands of artists on every continent working in glass as their primary material. The humble furnace that he and Labino lit in Toledo ignited a creative revolution that shows no sign of fading. In the ruins of Roman cities across the Mediterranean, archaeologists have found something that might surprise the modern consumer: evidence of systematic glass recycling. At sites in Britain, France, and Italy, excavations have uncovered stockpiles of broken glass, sorted by color and stored near workshops, waiting to be melted down and made into something new. The Romans, it turns out, were enthusiastic recyclers of glass, not because of any concern for the environment, but because recycling simply made economic sense. Broken glass melts at a lower temperature than raw materials, saving fuel and time. It also produces glass of more consistent quality. Roman workshops maintained a steady supply of broken glass alongside their raw ingredients, and the evidence suggests that shattered vessels were collected and traded specifically for the purpose of remelting. 2,000 years later, the economics of glass recycling remain fundamentally the same. Broken glass saves energy and money. Every 10% increase in the proportion of recycled glass used in a furnace reduces energy consumption by roughly 2.5 to 3%. A furnace running entirely on recycled glass reduces its carbon emissions by more than half compared to one using only raw materials. Every ton of recycled glass saves an estimated 670 kilograms of carbon emissions. These savings matter because glass manufacturing is an energy-hungry process. The industry produces more than 86 million tons of carbon globally each year, with the vast majority coming from the fuel burned to heat the furnaces. Despite these clear benefits, recycling rates vary enormously around the world. Europe leads, with an average recycling rate for glass packaging exceeding 67%, and individual countries like Belgium, Switzerland, and Sweden achieving rates above 90%. The United States, by contrast, recycles only about a third of its glass packaging, a rate that has actually fallen in recent years as recycling programs that mix all materials together have made it harder to collect glass that is clean enough to reuse. Glass mixed with paper, plastic, and other items in a single bin often breaks during collection and contaminates everything else, leading some programs to stop accepting glass altogether. The comparison between glass and plastic is more nuanced than popular opinion sometimes suggests. Glass production generates roughly 1/3 the greenhouse gas emissions of plastic production per unit of packaging. Glass can be recycled endlessly without any loss of quality, while plastic degrades with each cycle and is usually recycled only once or twice before being discarded. Only about 9% of plastic in the United States is recycled at all. And glass does not produce the tiny plastic particles that have become one of the most widespread environmental concerns of our time. Particles now found in human blood, in the deepest oceans, and in virtually every ecosystem on Earth. However, glass has its own drawbacks. It is heavier than plastic and aluminum, which means transporting it produces more emissions per unit of beverage delivered. The energy needed to make glass, even with lots of recycled material, remains substantial. And glass that is not recycled sits in landfills essentially forever, since it does not break down naturally. The most environmentally effective use of glass is not recycling but reuse. A glass bottle that is washed and refilled replaces roughly 20 single-use containers over its lifetime. Reuse systems in which bottles are returned, cleaned, and refilled were once the standard in most countries. The milkman's glass bottle, the returnable soda bottle, and the reusable beer bottle were fixtures of everyday life through most of the 20th century. These systems were dismantled as single-use containers proved cheaper for manufacturers, even though they imposed higher costs on the environment and on society as a whole. In recent years, there has been a growing effort to bring glass reuse back. Companies in Europe and North America have launched refillable bottle programs for beverages and household products. France passed a law requiring that 10% of beverages be sold in reusable packaging by 2027. Germany's long-standing deposit system, which charges a small fee on bottles and returns it when the container is brought back, achieves return rates above 95%. The glass industry itself is working to shrink its environmental footprint. The transition from gas-fired to electric furnaces powered by clean energy has the potential to cut carbon emissions from glass production by 80% or more. Furnaces that burn hydrogen, producing only water as a byproduct, are being tested as another path forward. The story of glass and the environment is ultimately about the difference between a material and a system. Glass as a material has wonderful environmental qualities. It is made from ingredients that are abundant everywhere on Earth. It does not leak harmful substances. It can be recycled forever. And it does not create the tiny particles of pollution that plastic does. But the system in which glass is made, shipped, and thrown away, a system built around single-use consumption and insufficient recycling, undermines many of these advantages. The task now is to build systems that match the potential of the material, systems that make reuse easy, improve recycling, and clean up the way glass is manufactured. If that can be done, glass, the world's oldest manufactured material, may prove to be one of its most sustainable. In a laboratory at a university in England, a surgeon carefully places a small granule of white powder into a cavity in a patient's jawbone where disease has destroyed the natural bone. The powder is not a drug, and it is not a mineral. It is, of all things, glass. This special glass, first invented in 1969, dissolves slowly in the body, releasing substances that coax the surrounding cells to grow new bone tissue. Within months, the glass granules have been completely absorbed and replaced by living bone indistinguishable from the patient's own. Glass, the material that ancient civilizations used to make beads and bottles, is now being used to heal the human body from the inside out. This is just one frontier in a period of glass innovation that may prove to be the most revolutionary since the invention of glassblowing 2,000 years ago. Across laboratories and factories around the world, researchers are developing glasses with properties that would have seemed impossible to every previous generation of glassmakers. Glass that changes from clear to dark at the flip of a switch. Glass stronger than steel. Glass that generates electricity. Glass that cleans itself. Glass that can bend and fold without breaking. Glass that can change its transparency on demand is among the most commercially advanced of these new technologies. In the most common type, a thin coating of a special material is sandwiched between two layers of glass. When a small electrical current is applied, the coating darkens and blocks incoming sunlight. When the current is reversed, the glass returns to its clear state. The whole process takes only seconds and uses very little power, since the glass stays in whatever state it is set to without needing continuous electricity. These smart windows are already being installed in office buildings, airports, and luxury vehicles, replacing mechanical blinds and allowing people to control light and warmth with precision and elegance. Other versions of switchable glass use tiny particles suspended in a liquid between the glass layers. When an electrical field is turned on, the particles line up and the glass becomes clear. When the field is removed, the particles scatter and the glass turns opaque. The most dramatic type can switch between a fully transparent state and a mirror-like reflective state, offering windows that become mirrors on demand. A completely different type of innovation is glass made not from the traditional sand-based ingredients but from metal. When certain metal mixtures are cooled so rapidly that their atoms have no time to arrange into neat patterns, the result is a metal with the disordered structure of glass. This metallic glass can be twice as strong as the best steel while being significantly lighter. It springs back to its original shape after being bent. It resists wear and corrosion. And unlike ordinary metals, which have tiny weak points at the boundaries between their internal crystals, metallic glass has no such boundaries, giving it uniform strength throughout. It has already found uses in sports equipment and surgical instruments, and researchers believe its potential extends to aircraft components, precision machinery, and even protective armor. Self-cleaning glass, already available for sale, uses a thin coating on its surface that breaks down dirt and grime when exposed to sunlight. Rain then washes the loosened residue away, keeping the glass clean without any human effort. This is especially useful for windows that are difficult or dangerous to reach, like those on tall buildings. Glass that generates electricity is another emerging technology. By embedding thin solar cells directly into the glass, researchers have created windows and building surfaces that can produce power while still letting light through. The efficiency is currently lower than that of dedicated solar panels, but the advantage is that the enormous glass surfaces of modern buildings could be turned into power-generating assets. Scientists have developed transparent solar cells that could theoretically transform every window in a city into a solar collector. Glass that bends, once a contradiction in terms, has become a commercial reality. Sheets of glass only a fraction of a millimeter thick can now be wrapped around a cylinder or folded without breaking. These ultra-thin flexible glasses are enabling entirely new categories of electronic devices, including folding phones, rollable screens, and wearable technology. The ancient material that has always been associated with fragility is being reinvented as something that can bend, twist, and flex. And now, as the story of glass nears its close, let us take a moment to look back at the journey we have traveled together. We began in the volcanic highlands of ancient Turkey, where a hunter knelt beside a dark, gleaming outcrop of obsidian. We crossed the deserts of Libya, where pale green glass had lain in the sand for 28 million years before a pharaoh's craftsman shaped it into a scarab. We watched as potters in Mesopotamia noticed something strange forming in their kilns, and we followed that discovery through the workshops of Egypt, where glassmakers coaxed colors from their furnaces that rivaled precious gems. We saw the furnaces go cold when the Bronze Age world collapsed, and we watched the Phoenicians revive the craft centuries later. We stood beside an anonymous worker on the eastern Mediterranean coast who picked up a hollow tube and, with a single breath, changed the world forever. We traveled with Roman glass across 3 continents and marveled at a cup that changes color depending on how the light falls upon it. We followed glass into the Islamic world, where enameled lamps hung in the great mosques and a scientist in Cairo laid the foundations of modern optics. We considered why the civilizations of East Asia, with all their brilliance, chose ceramics over glass, and we traced the tiny beads that traveled the Silk Road from one end of the world to the other. We heard the story of Africa's glass, rich and complex and shadowed by the cruelty of the slave trade. We stood in the colored light of Chartres Cathedral and watched the wandering glassmakers of the northern forests build their furnaces beside the trees. We crossed to the island of Murano, where genius was imprisoned and trade secrets were guarded with threats of death. We followed the spies who stole those secrets and carried them to France and England. We saw humanity look into a glass mirror and for the first time see its own face clearly. We watched as small glass lenses perched on the nose extended the productive years of every scholar and craftsman, and we followed 2 other arrangements of glass lenses, one that reached the stars and one that revealed the invisible kingdom of life in a drop of water. We entered the laboratories where glass beakers and flasks made modern science possible, and we traced the evolution of the humble bottle from fragile luxury to everyday container. We saw glass fill our windows and transform our buildings, shelter our plants in greenhouses, and give its name to the great environmental challenge of our time. We watched the Industrial Revolution make glass cheap and common, and we paused to remember the children and workers who paid the human cost of that transformation. We followed glass across America, from Jamestown to Tiffany, and across Bohemia, where crystal chandeliers turned candlelight into rainbows. We witnessed the quiet genius of a man washing dishes who imagined molten glass floating on liquid tin, and we watched his invention make the modern world possible. We looked up at glass towers that define our cities, and down at glass fibers that carry our words and images beneath the oceans. We felt the smooth surface of a phone screen, the most sophisticated piece of glass ever made, resting in our palm. And now we have arrived here, at the edge of what glass may become, a material that heals bones, generates power, bends without breaking, and changes at the touch of a switch. 5,000 years ago, someone in a workshop noticed something luminous forming in a kiln, picked it up, and wondered what it was. That moment of curiosity launched a material revolution that has touched every part of human life, from art to science, from architecture to medicine, from the first trade routes to the digital networks that connect us all. Glass was born from sand and fire. It is transparent and fragile and endlessly adaptable, and its story, like the material itself, is far from finished. So let that thought settle gently as you rest. Let the long, quiet history of glass accompany you into sleep, the story of a material as old as volcanoes and as new as tomorrow. Good night and sleep well.